Real quickly before we begin, I want to thank this video's sponsor, CarMarshal.com. CarMarshal.com can save you lots of money on buying used or new vehicles, cars, trucks, school buses. If you want to save money, I'll have a link in the description down below. I know I'm going to
Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, Facebook able to listen to you at home and work. By Paula Bolliard, March 27, 2018. Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Christopher Wylie, appearing before a committee of British MPs on Tuesday, said that Facebook has the ability to spy on users in their homes and offices. The British Parliament is investigating Cambridge Analytica's involvement in the Brexit election. MP Damian Collins, who chaired the committee, asked Wylie whether Facebook has the ability to listen to what people are talking about in order to better target them with ads. There's been various speculation about the fact that Facebook can, through the Facebook app on your smartphone, listen into what people are talking about and discussing and using that to prioritize the advertising as well, Collins said. Other people would say, no, they don't think it's possible. It's just that the Facebook system is just so good at predicting what you're interested in that it can guess. He asked for Wylie's thoughts on the possibility. Want Facebook regulation? Be careful what you wish for. On a comment about using audio and processing audio, you can use it for, my understanding generally of how companies use it, not just Facebook, but generally other apps that pull audio, is for environmental context, Wylie said. So if, for example, you have a television playing versus if you're in a busy place with a lot of people talking versus a work environment. He clarified, it's not to say they're listening to what you're saying. It's not natural language processing. That would be hard to scale. But to understand the environmental context of where you are to improve the contextual value of the ad itself is possible. Wylie continued, there's audio that could be useful just in terms of are you in an office environment, are you outside, are you watching TV? Facebook has long denied allegations that its app listens in on users in order to customize ads. I run ads product at Facebook. We don't, and have never, used your microphone for ads. Just not true, Rob Goldman, Vice President of Ads Products at Facebook, tweeted on October 2017. That includes Facebook-owned Instagram, he added. But users have raised concerns about the practice after observing that they've been targeted with ads for products they've never expressed an interest in online. Many Facebook users have reported examples and alleged evidence that the app is listening in on their conversations. During the hearing, the former employee of Cambridge Analytica, who told MPs that he's a progressive Eurosceptic, was also asked whether the company used coercion to achieve their desired electoral results. Citing the Nigeria project as an example, Wylie said he got incredibly panicked phone calls from people involved in the project. Several people were threatened with their lives and they had to immediately leave the country, he said. Gun videos hit Pornhub as YouTube tightens the noose. Wylie told the committee that he was informed by Cambridge Analytica shortly after he began his position that Dan Murison, his predecessor, had been poisoned and died in Kenya after a political deal went wrong. Emphasizing that what he had heard was pure speculation, Wylie said he had been told police had been bribed not to enter the hotel room where Murison had been found. My predecessor was found dead. One of my former co-workers had a massive head injury and is missing part of his skull. People do get hurt at this firm. He added that people are afraid to come forward to talk about the company because it's that intimidating. In an apparent pushback, Cambridge Analytica tweeted that Wylie's role in the company had been limited. Cambridge Analytica. Heavy checkmark. At Cam Analytica. Christopher Wylie was a part-time contractor who left in July 2014 and has no direct knowledge of our work or practices since that date. 7:35 a.m., March 27, 2018. 39. 115 people are talking about this. Twitter ads info and privacy. You can watch the entire hearing below. The discussion of Facebook's alleged audio surveillance begins at 2:58. You can watch the entire hearing below. The discussion of Facebook's alleged audio surveillance begins at 2:58.
Welcome to this further evidence session of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee as part of our inquiry into disinformation and fake news. I'd like to welcome Christopher Wiley and Paul-Olivier de Hay to the committee to give evidence this morning. Before we start the committee session, I would just like to give an update on the invitation of the Select Committee to Mark Zuckerberg to give evidence before us. We believe, given the serious nature of the allegations that have been made around the access and use of Facebook user data, that it is appropriate that Mark Zuckerberg should give evidence to the committee. He has suggested that Chris Cox, the Chief Product Officer at Facebook, could come to London to give evidence to the committee in the first week after the Easter recess. So we'll be very happy to invite Mr. Cox to give evidence. However, we would still like to hear from Mr. Zuckerberg as well. We will seek to clarify with Facebook whether he is available to give evidence or not, because that wasn't clear from our correspondence. And if he is available to give evidence, then we will be happy to do that either in person or by video link, if that would be more convenient for him. If there are any, happy to answer any further questions about that after the hearing, but that is all we'd like to say on that at this time. We turn now to the evidence session this morning. If I could ask Chris Wiley first. As you know, a lot of the committee's work over the last few weeks has been looking at the role of Cambridge Analytica in the data analytics business and their campaigns, and we heard evidence from Alexander Nix a few weeks ago. Perhaps you could, for the benefit of the committee and the record, just explain how you first became involved with Alexander Nix and Cambridge Analytica.
Sure. So I first joined SCL Group, which is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, actually before Cambridge Analytica existed in June 2013. I got introduced to him through a mutual contact that I had worked with previously in UK politics. The firm SCL had an opening for a research director, in part because the past research director died in his hotel room in Kenya when he was working for Uhuru Kenyatta. I didn't know that at the time. Part of the reason why I got chosen to become research director is because the firm was looking to expand its digital capacity and sort of keep up with developments that were happening, particularly on the military side, looking at how information spreads online and developing new IP that they could then, pass on to clients, whether that's political or military. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And could you just talk again for the record, just explain how long you worked at and with Cambridge Analytica and what caused you to leave the company?
Sure. So when I started in June 2013, Cambridge Analytica didn't exist yet. So and it's important for people to understand that Cambridge Analytica is more of a concept or a brand than anything else, because it doesn't actually have employees. It's all SCL. It's just the front-facing company for the United States. But I started at SCL Group in June 2013. In July 2014, that's when I told Alexander Nix that I didn't want to continue working at the time Cambridge Analytica. Although I scaled down my work until the 2014 midterms, so a year and a half. And Cambridge Analytica, just to be clear, was set up in large part because of the research that I was doing at SCL Group. So it was the IP that we were creating was acquired by Robert Mercer, and Cambridge Analytica became the vehicle to sort of acquire that IP.
Yeah. How would you said that Cambridge Analytica doesn't have any employees, that effectively they're all employed by SCL.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you characterize the relationship between these different companies? I mean, is it in effect one organization that exists behind different facades?
Yeah, I mean, so Cambridge Analytica was set up in part because, first of all, there was, so the way it works is CA was set up, and SCL Elections, which is part of SCL Group, which is a group company. SCL Elections became a minority shareholder, and then Robert Mercer became the majority shareholder of Cambridge Analytica. SCL then assigned its intellectual property to Cambridge Analytica, and then Cambridge Analytica licensed back the IP to SCL Elections, and then also granted SCL Elections an exclusivity contract whereby all projects from Cambridge Analytica would be given to SCL to work on, although the actual contracting on the client-facing side would be with Cambridge Analytica. Partly that was because in the United States there's particular rules against foreign actors in elections, so having an American company was beneficial for that purpose. Also, Robert Mercer's lawyers were concerned about two things. Firstly, the optics of acquiring a UK military contractor to work in American elections. Optically, that wouldn't necessarily play well. And secondly, they were concerned about some of the history of the shareholders in the company, as well as some of the past projects they had worked on.
The company being SCL in that
SCL,
yeah. So Cambridge Analytica was a kind of a company set up with the purpose of doing political work in America.
In the United States, with a new brand that was sort of untainted by any history or legacy of past projects or shareholders.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people will say, and are saying, that given that you're someone who worked very closely with these people for a period of time and understand this world very well and have built your career working in it, why have you decided to speak out against it and give evidence against people who used to be your colleagues?
Because, as a citizen, one is expected and has a duty to report unlawful activity. In terms of if you're asking about sort of my journey to this moment, a lot of people have asked me, why is it taking you so long? What they don't see is that actually I've been working on this with The Guardian and then later the New York Times and Channel 4 for a year. So what you're seeing is sort of the apex or the climax of that. But this is a year-long coming out process. But before going public, I went and started working with the ICO and UK authorities to start their investigation. Also, after I left Cambridge Analytica, very shortly after that, I got threatened with legal action and had, a very aggressive team of lawyers coming after me. So I signed an undertaking of confidentiality, which would mean that if I did break that, I could be sued into oblivion by Robert Mercer. So frankly, that's intimidating. But more broadly, it was only until 2016 when I was working at CA and setting it up. You don't appreciate the future impact of what your work is until it starts to happen. And so 2016 was, where I started looking at what this company was actually doing in the United States, and, coming to appreciate that the projects that I was working on may have had a much wider impact than I initially anticipated it would. And after Donald Trump got inaugurated, very shortly after that, that's when I started working with Carol at The Guardian on reporting some of the things that the company was doing. So for the spring, I was one of her key sources anonymously until we could figure out a legal position that would then allow me to come forward.
So you, it'd be fair to say that for you, Donald Trump's election sort of crossed a line. You felt that techniques that you were aware of had been used, shouldn't have been used in the way they were used during the campaign, and therefore you felt that you felt you had to speak out about it. Would that be a way of characterizing it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's just because of Donald Trump, but Donald Trump kind of makes it click in your head that this actually has a much wider impact. I don't think that military-style information operations is conducive for any democratic process, whether it's a U.S. presidential or a local council race.
Yeah. Could I ask as well about the relation when Cambridge Analytica was founded? I mean, who do you think sort of, in terms of how the algorithm, the database that Cambridge Analytica worked from, was that something it inherited from SCL, or was that something that you developed, or was it developed by other people?
No, SCL. This is partly why I was brought on as research director, because SCL was falling behind in its technical capacity and its quantitative, skill set. So it didn't. SCL before I joined did not have any data assets. So that was in large part why I got hired. So it was the Ripon project that actually scaled, acquired, data and scaled it. It was at that moment where they started becoming more focused on data science and machine learning.
Well, is it true? I've seen it reported that the name Cambridge Analytica was Steve Bannon's. Is that correct?
Yeah, because it's sort of a bizarre story. So Alexander Nix has his sort of standard pitch, as it were, and it often relies heavily on, we have offices in Mayfair, and I went to Eton, and, presenting a very sort of posh veneer onto the company, which, when you look at their clientele in a lot of the, it's a lot of developing countries in the Commonwealth, and there's still sort of that sort of image, plays well with certain types of clients that he had worked with in the past. Problem was that for Steve Bannon, he didn't really care about that. He was much more interested in, going and speaking at student events at Cambridge than, sitting in a posh office in Mayfair. So Alexander realized that, and he decided to set up a fake office in Cambridge so that whenever Steve Bannon, this is before Steve Bannon came on board to which, set up a project which eventually became CA. And so whenever Bannon would come, we set up this fake office, and to sort of present a more academic side of the company. And it was from that Steve Bannon decided we should call it Cambridge Analytica because of how closely associated it was with the university. Because in his head, it was a very academic company. Okay.
And other than that geographical proximity, did the company have any particular relationship with Cambridge University?
It didn't have a formal relationship, but we did work with a lot of professors at the University of Cambridge, in particular the psychology department and the psychometric center.
Okay, so they would do research projects and assist with developing techniques and feeding ideas.
Yeah. We would use the Cambridge has an amazing psychology department. It's one of the top, if not the top, in the world for psychology. So. It was a real resource to have that very close to us. So we did work with several professors at the psychology department on developing psychometric inventories, and also looking more broadly at the research that was coming out of the university in psychological profiling using online data exhaust. So, a lot of the papers that eventually became the foundation of the methods that were then used on the Ripon project, that all came out of research that was being done at the University of Cambridge, some of which was funded in part by DARPA, for example, which is the US military's research agency.
And did you just approach academics on an ad hoc basis, or was there any engagement with the university authorities or any of the departments?
We definitely talked to some of the more senior professors, but it was all, there was nothing formalized with the university itself. Mm-hmm. So it was all done, professor to professor to professor, but it sort of sat in a gray area. I mean, when Rip-On was happening, we had a lot of people who we were engaging at Cambridge who provided, who played a pivotal role in actually getting that project going.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Paul Farrelly.
Thank you, Chair. So essentially your central motivation has been that you're rather aghast that techniques in the social media world that have been used for military psyops purposes are being used in the political domain.
I mean, that's a part of it. I think also more broadly, when you look at how Cambridge Analytica operates or how SCL operates, they don't care whether or not what they do is legal as long as it gets the job done. So it's not, there's been a lot of focus on the data side of things, and there's been a lot of focus on targeting, but more broadly, this is a company that goes around the world and undermines civic institutions of countries that are struggling to develop those institutions. So there's a lot of reasons why I find the company problematic. It's not just the data. It's also more broadly that they are an example of what modern day colonialism looks like. You have a wealthy company from a developed nation going into an economy or a democracy that's still struggling to get its feet on the ground, and taking advantage of that to profit from that. So there's several reasons why I find the company problematic.
So do they sort of like to have an aura, do you think, of being the schmash of the modern digital age?
The smash?
Smash. So James Bond, the evil organisation that manipulates things here, there, and everywhere across the world.
I think if you watch the Channel 4 Undercover, for example, I think you can see for yourself that they know that that's the brand that they present, and they cultivate that. I think they find it amusing.
No, I sort of get it, and I didn't quite know what to make of Mr. Nix when he came to us, apart from that he was a corporate financier who sought a sort of a higher calling, as he almost said it to us. But I do remember on the Channel 4, one of the most hilarious bits was a chap called Mark Turnbull, who got a big plaster on his nose, I think, saying that he was a master of disguise.
He doesn't always have the plaster on his nose.
Okay. There's just before we want to get around onto some of the things that happen in different parts of the world, but just before we do, I just wanted to just probe into your predecessor who died in Kenya.
Yeah.
Was that I've not heard of that, working for the Kenyatta campaign?
Yeah.
Were there any suspicious circumstances?
I've heard several different stories as to what actually happened, so I don't know which story is accurate, but it didn't sound, when you work in Kenyan politics or politics in a lot of African countries, if a deal goes wrong, you can pay for it.
So is this a matter of public record, or is this new now?
Dan, who's my predecessor, his death did cause some news coverage in Romania because he was the son of a cabinet minister in Romania who is now in jail for corruption charges, I think. But so he came from a political family in Romania. So the fact that he died was news, but the circumstances of his death, I've heard different stories, so I'm not sure which is.
And his name was Dan?
Dan, his surname starts with an M. And
Muresan.
Yeah,
Dan
Muresan.
Muresan.
Could you spell that just for the record?
Muresan.
Okay.
He was working simultaneously in India, I think, and there is also some coverage
Simultaneously
from there.
in India?
Yes.
I mean, this, when you look at Facebook's biggest market, I mentioned this in the States as well, you know, India is the top in terms of numbers of users, and obviously that's a country where, you know, which is rife with political discord and opportunities for destabilization. So that
They've worked extensively in India. They have an office in India.
I think that's something we might want to pursue later. But just on this point, when you were told that there was a vacancy because your predecessor died in Kenya, what explanation did the company give to you of that death?
Just to clarify, when I got hired, I wasn't told that my predecessor died in Kenya in his hotel room. That was several months after, when I asked about who was I actually replacing, because I was looking for some old files and I couldn't find. So I did realize that I didn't actually know the name of the person who I replaced. So I asked about, you know, looking through old files, and that's where it came out that he died.
So same question 2 months on then. What explanation were you given of the? How old was he? Do you know?
He was in his 30s.
Did they give you an explanation?
I mean, they did. Just if I explain it, just if you understand that it's pure speculation. So
Sure.
it's not. I'm not stating this as a matter of fact. I'm just repeating, you know, what I heard. What I heard was that he was working on some kind of deal of some sort. I'm not sure exactly what kind of deal it is, but when you work for senior politicians in a lot of these countries, you don't actually make money in the electoral work. You make money in the influence brokering, you know, after the fact. And that a deal went sour, and again, this is what I've been told, so I'm not saying this as a matter of fact, but people suspected that he was poisoned in his hotel room. I also heard that the police got bribed to not enter the hotel room for 24 hours. But that is what I was told. I wasn't there, so I can't, you know, speak to the veracity of that account. But that's what I was told.
Okay, well, we'll leave that there for the moment because there are plenty of journalists who might want to follow some of those interesting leads. One of the things that as Mr. Nix was at pains to stress when he was in front of us was that, you know, there were different companies, different entities. Data could go one way but not another way because of government contracting. But there was like one name that came up as the data control that was common between Cambridge Analytica and SCL, just almost demonstrating that, you know, there were common personnel, notwithstanding the denials. Was a lady called Jordana Zeta. Do you know her?
I do not.
No. So it's just a name.
It's just a name, but they do put lots of random names on all kinds of things.
Okay. I mean, there's also we've just been. I don't know whether you've seen that, which is a pictogram of the SCL structure. It's
Sure.
been done by an independent journalist, and it's just from filings at Companies House, and
Sure.
So it's fairly standard, but it's fairly complicated for a relatively
I'd
small
wager that
company.
there's probably more companies than even what's on that piece of paper.
But there are some interesting sort of names that crop up. Mr. Nix we know about. Sort of Etonian salesman, I think you almost described him as.
I mean, he my understanding is that the reason why Alexander Nix was involved in SCL was because his father had shares in the company and his father died. He inherited shares, or there was some deal that was done, because he has no background in psychology, tech, you know, politics, any of the things that they operate in. which is why he's a salesman. He likes to sell stuff.
And while I was cooking Sunday lunch this weekend, I listened to a BBC profile of Nigel Oakes.
Right.
Did you come across him?
Yes, although not day to day. So when we were setting up Cambridge Analytica, the reason why one of the reasons why SCL Elections, rather than either the group company or another entity, was the minority shareholder, was because Alexander Nix wanted to keep more control for himself, and he was quite paranoid about some of the other shareholders and directors in the group company. So he made a concerted effort to sort of keep this project away from the others as long as possible. But I did come across him several times. It's just what I'm saying is that it wasn't day to day. I didn't work with
Nigel Oakes. Mr. Oakes came across as a founding eminence grise.
Sorry?
From this profile, Mr. Oakes came across as the founding eminence grise behind the whole of the whole project.
No, not for Cambridge Analytica. For SCL, yes,
For SCL.
but not for Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica was Steve Bannon, Robert Mercer, and Alexander Nix. Most of those negotiations happened in America. They kept it pretty separate from the sort of legacy shareholders and directors of SCL. Okay. But he played a pivotal role in actually setting up SCL Group.
Can I just throw the role of a couple of other people? The role of the chairman, Julian Wheatland, and Victor Cengiz,
which
appears.
They got rid of Cengiz when they were finalizing the Cambridge Analytica deal, because the Mercer lawyers didn't like Cengiz's involvement, because apparently he had fairly sketchy business dealings that they didn't want to be associated with.
Okay. And Julian Wheatland, what was his role?
He was, I believe, the chairman. So he didn't sort of do much. He sort of was like the queen of the company, if that makes sense.
So you
not to say that the queen doesn't do a lot. I don't interpret that as a slight of it.
Mean head.
I'm just putting these other names up in because there's a danger that one focuses just on Mr. Nix, who's got a very sinister surname.
Yeah. So a lot of these guys, their role is not actually to do work; it's to do deals. Right? So they don't actually do anything day to day. They're the ones who, because of their family or because of their businesses or what have you, just have a very wide network of people, not just here in the UK, but in particular in Africa and various developing countries that enable the company to go and get working contracts. So their roles were usually like as the introducer, as the deal maker, not managing the day-to-day operations of the company.
Would you characterize them as people who wanted to make a fortune out of this, or people who were genuinely curious about the ability through social media in the digital age for them to be able to manipulate outcomes in politics?
You have to remember that a lot of these people are very wealthy already, so it's not Alexander Nix in particular, right? There was one time where he had to go, and we were running late because he had to pick up a 200,000-pound chandelier. So he there's these are people who don't need to make a lot of money, but the thing that I learned is that for certain wealthy people, they need something to keep them occupied, and they need projects. And going into the developing world and sort of running a country is something that appeals to them.
Okay, and I've just got one last question, really.
Sorry, I didn't mean that in a flippant way. If that came across as flippant, sorry.
This chart has got no mention of aggregate IQ or SCL Canada as it styled itself. So what's the relationship between that Canadian company and the rest of this group?
Yeah. So very shortly after I became research director at SCL, and I was sort of given the directive or the mandate to expand the company's software capacity and technological infrastructure, we obviously needed people to do that. So I reached out to people who had worked on previous projects with, who I respected. One of those people was Jeff Sylvester, who is now the CTO of Aggregate IQ. So in the first email that I sent, which I've also passed on to the committee, I've passed on several folders of documents. You know, the first email where I tell Jeff that I've just become research director, this is what we do, his immediate reaction is, you need a Canadian office. So he replied, you need a Canadian office. When I went to Alexander Nix and I said, there's a couple Canadians that I want to hire, he said, fine, but they have to come here and work in London. So when I talked with Jeff and several other people who then later became AIQ, they had you know, new families, you know, just got a house. It's not easy to just get up and move to a different country when you have young kids, right? So I went back to Alexander and said, look, they're not mobile, but I think they'd be really helpful because they're really good at what they do. So the compromise was that a Canadian company would be set up that would enable the Canadians who wanted to work on the projects, and keep in mind at the time this is SCL, this is before Cambridge Analytica got set up. So primarily we were focused on projects in the developing world. But the deal was that they would sign an intellectual property license whereby all of the work that they were doing for the company would then be assigned to SCL Group, and that they would trade that they would trade as SCL Canada, but they set up a Canadian entity, and that the legal name was Aggregate IQ. That was also in part because, you know, when you work in a lot of countries, sometimes it's beneficial to have different, you know, billing names on invoices, and you know, if you're working in a country that has declarable expenses and all of that, sure, you can particularly if you're trying to get around coordination rules, like in the United States, which have very strict non-coordination rules, if you can actually bill as several different companies, but it's the same team working on it, the paperwork looks compliant, even if the project isn't.
So it's a Canadian-based shell company, effectively.
Yeah, I would sort of call it like a franchise, as it were. So in internal staff documents, so for example, this internal staff list, which I've also passed on to the committee, AIQ staff are listed under SCL Canada. So the internal documents of the company refer to this entity, AIQ, as SCL Canada. As you know, as I've been saying for months now, but as has now been validated yesterday by Gizmodo, which is a website that has actually found the code base that AIQ built that shows that AIQ actually built the Ripon platform for Cambridge Analytica. So there's now tangible proof in the public domain that AIQ actually built Ripon, which is the software that utilized the algorithms from the Facebook data. I could talk more about some of the other projects that AIQ has worked on. So for example, Nigeria, the Nigerian project in 2015, that Carol at The Guardian has touched on in her reporting, where the company utilized the services of an Israeli private intelligence firm. That firm is Black Cube. That's not being reported, although Channel 4 has undercover footage that they haven't been able to put into the public domain of Alexander Nix talking about the relationship with Black Cube. Black Cube on the Nigeria project was engaged to hack the now president of Nigeria, Buhari, to get access to his medical records and private emails. AIQ worked on that project. So Aggregate IQ was was handed material in Nigeria from Cambridge Analytica to distribute online. So that's distribution of compromat, and that's also distribution of incredibly threatening and violent video content, which I've also passed on to the committee. The videos that AIQ distributed in Nigeria with the sole intent of intimidating voters included content where people were being dismembered, where people were having their throats cut and bled to death in a ditch. They were being burned alive. There's incredibly anti-Islamic and threatening messages portraying Muslims as violent, and this is, again, so you've got Aggregate IQ, which received 40% of Vote Leave's funding, also working on projects that involved hacked material and compromat and distributing violent videos of people being bled to death to intimidate voters. And this is the company that played an incredibly pivotal role in politics here. So something that I would strongly recommend to the committee is that they actually, not only push the authorities here, but really give them, the support that they need in order to actually investigate this company and what they were doing in Brexit.
I've just got one final question because my colleague Julie Elliott wants to come in. Most of the reporting here has been focused on the Cambridge Analytica link or lack of link with leave.eu, rather than it or its entities links with Vote Leave, both from the Vote Leave campaign and also the money that's been diverted off to Believe. The other focus of reporting has been the number of the amount of Facebook data that's been collected through Alexander Kogan's activities, which mostly seems to relate to the States. But clearly the question underlying all this is, if you're going to spend such a lot of money trying to influence the UK referendum, then to be able to try and do that, you have to have a set of data on lots of UK individuals to make it worth people's while spending the money with you. So I hope that is the extent of the UK data that's held by Cambridge Analytica and its affiliates and associates might come out in this session.
One of the things that I've also passed on to the committee is some of the contractual documentation and emails from some of AIQ's past projects. One of them was for the at the time the Minister of National Security of Trinidad. In the contractual documents and then also email chains, AIQ, part of the project was to go out and find a way of accessing raw internet service provider data for the entire country to monitor what people were browsing in that country. As I understand it, that's not legal in Trinidad. It certainly wouldn't be legal here. But the thing that I would say is that Aggregate IQ, in part because it was set up and works within the auspices of Cambridge Analytica, inherited a lot of the company culture of total disregard for the law. And so I would, again, strongly encourage actually looking at this question of where did they get the data? When I met with Dom Cummings in November 2015, one of the things that was apparent is that Vote Leave at the time actually didn't have any data. So to go, and that's in November 2015. So, and Dom Cummings, in part, wanted to meet with me because he was really interested in Cambridge Analytica. He also said that he wanted to create the quote-unquote Palantir for politics. And, but it became apparent that it's like, well, if you don't even have the electoral register, let alone, a social database, you can't really do this, or you can't really do this legally. Very shortly after that meeting, they then engage AIQ. I think in part, although this bit is me speculating, I think in part because they couldn't, it would look odd if Leave EU was working with Cambridge Analytica and Vote Leave was working with Cambridge Analytica. But you could get the next best thing, which is a company that can do virtually everything that CA can do, but with a different, billing name for your invoices. But my question is, where did you get the data? Because how do you create a massive targeting operation in a country that AIQ hadn't previously worked in 2 months? It baffles me as to how that could happen in such a short amount of time. So that's a good question. It's unfortunate that AIQ hides behind jurisdictional barriers and doesn't actually come here and answer those questions. But it is something that hopefully can be looked at. So how did it actually work? This is a company that has worked with hacked material, right? This is a company that will send out videos of people being murdered to intimidate voters. This is a company that goes out and tries to illicitly acquire, live internet browsing data of everyone in an entire country. So I think a lot of questions should be asked about the role of aggregate IQ in this election and whether they were indeed actually compliant with the law here, beyond just suspending infractions.
Thank you. I understand that quite a few colleagues want to come in on this particular point. If I could just say for the record of people following the proceedings, Chris Wiley's given the committee access to a large number of documents that he has. We received those this morning, and we will be looking to go through those and discuss those with him with a view to publishing some of those documents probably tomorrow, but certainly as soon as we can practically go through them and look through them. Can I just ask, the allegations you make about AIQ and Nigeria are very serious. The documents and the folders you've given us, they provide evidence to support that allegation.
So you have the video, one of the videos that I'm referring to, and I'd recommend following Carol's reporting on the matter, because she's done a ton of work on researching it, and she's actually published some articles on the Nigeria hacking scheme also. But AIQ was involved in the Nigeria project. Both as the company and then several people also individually who all also frequently work at AIQ.
Yeah, thank you. So, Julian, Ian. Okay.
Can I just ask a very short question? I just want to put to Mr. Wiley a statement that was made by Aggregate IQ on their website on Saturday the 24th of March 2018.
Sure.
They said, Aggregate IQ is a digital advertising, web and software development company based in Canada. It is and has always been 100% Canadian owned and operated. Aggregate IQ has never been and is not a part of Cambridge Analytica or SCL. What is your reaction to that statement?
They're using weasel words. So that is all technically true.
Yeah.
Okay, but let me be super clear. Okay, so they are based in Canada. That is true. They are a Canadian company. That is true. They are not owned, but they have licensed their intellectual property, right? Secondly, the basis of the software of Cambridge Analytica, right? So for example, the Ripon project, they built that. They operate as an internal entity. They're kept at an arm's length in part because that was useful for particularly American projects where you need different entities to work on campaigns and PACs and various other entities where you can't necessarily coordinate. But if you have different companies, you can, the paperwork looks appropriate and the paperwork looks compliant even if, behind the scenes you're talking back and forth and using the same underlying technology. They built Ripon. Ripon was the software that these algorithms went into that then deployed the data to target. The actual sort of advertising deployment was on them. That's what they did. So it's fine and dandy for them to say, we're a Canadian company. That's true. But if you sort of unmask what they actually do and look at how they actually operate and the projects that they've actually worked on, You know, the overwhelming majority of those projects and the overwhelming majority of their income comes from and came from Cambridge Analytica and SCL.
Are you in a position to say definitively today that Cambridge Analytica shared its data with AIQ?
It depends on what you mean by its data. So
shared any data?
Yes, absolutely. You can't create software that deploys adverts or targets people online or has a front-end interface for you to query data without actually accessing the data itself, right? You can't have targeting software that doesn't access the database, right? So CA would have the database, Cambridge Analytica or AIQ would be able to access that because otherwise the software doesn't work. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. We have evidence now that Facebook data was used by Cambridge Analytica. Mm-hmm. And I think it's accepted even by Facebook that information was unlawfully transferred to Cambridge Analytica. Mm-hmm. Can you say that AIQ had access to that data?
Yes, because that's what the Ripon software and the Ripon project was the modeling of that Facebook data amongst other data sets, and then the deployment of that data in online targeting and various other political projects, and it was Aggregate IQ that actually built the software for that. And so I provided documents in terms of the what I provided to the committee is the contractual documents for that and the IP licensing for that. But yesterday, the website Gizmodo actually has found a lot of the actual underlying code with the software development comments. Between AIQ and SCL developers. So not only do you have access to the contractual documents which I provided to the committee, but also, if you look at what Gizmodo is reporting, you can actually see the code.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I think, if you don't mind, I think Rebecca's got one quick question on this point, if you don't mind, then we'll come on to you.
Because thank you for that. What I was actually going to ask it. I was so interested in you saying earlier, where did they get the data from? And I just wanted to get this sort of on the record because we had Alexander Nix here, and I asked him about whether they'd used Facebook data, and he categorically said, we don't work with Facebook, we do not have Facebook data, but we do use it as a platform to advertise, we do gather data from Facebook, and we do surveys. So
we don't have Facebook data, but we gather Facebook data.
So what would you say to that? Do you, just on the record, do you think that was just absolutely a lie, that in fact they did have Facebook data, they were gathering it, they were using it? And on the back of that, if we have this link between Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ, of which Robert Mercer owns the company, surely they must be using the data.
So, to address your first point, it is categorically untrue that Cambridge Analytica has never used Facebook data. Facebook data and the acquisition using Alexander Kogan's app was the foundational data set of the company. That is how the algorithms were developed. They spent $1 million at least on that acquisition project. And so for him, and by the way, what I've provided to the committee is the signed contracts, okay, with Alexander Kogan's signature and Alexander Nix's signature on a contract that references using an app that harvests Facebook data and the friend network data also.
So they've led us up the garden path for a long time, and now we're getting to the bottom of it.
I think Alexander Nix's comments to your committee were exceptionally misleading. And frankly, I would say not only misleading, but I think they were dishonest.
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I may. There's also been on YouTube, on the public record in a way, for a long time, 2 videos from 2015 where you see interns, at least one of the videos, you see an intern that was working at Cambridge Analytica that was describing his work in a public forum. His work using Facebook likes to model psychographics. And he's describing his work at Cambridge Analytica. When The Guardian contacted Cambridge Analytica, the video was removed, even though it was controlled by a different entity called ASI Data Science. So I had managed to download that video, so I have it, and I put it on the record.
And by the way, ASI Data Science also worked for Vote Leave. And ASI was one of the subcontractors to Cambridge Analytica, and they provided a lot of the data scientists that Cambridge Analytica used to do their modeling work. So Vote Leave used Aggregate IQ. They also used ASI. Their Chief Technology Officer, Tom Borick, also worked on projects for SCL Group in Trinidad and Antigua. So I think, more broadly, a question should be asked is why is it that all these entities were being used? Given that Dom Cummings was very interested in Cambridge Analytica, and not only Cambridge Analytica, but more broadly, Robert Mercer's work in Renaissance Technologies, which is his hedge fund. What did Dom Cummings know, and why is it that he was using Aggregate IQ and ASI Data Science? Why is it that their CTO was also somebody who ran projects for SCL Group around the world? I mean, these are, and to her credit, Carol at The Guardian has been raising these questions for a year now. So I think it would be appropriate for your committee and other committees to start raising those questions also. What was happening inside of Vote Leave, and why were these companies chosen?
Thank you. Julie Elliott.
Thank you. This is fascinating, and quite a lot of the things that I've asked have come out, was wanting to ask, have come out in evidence, but it sounds to me as if all of these different names of things are to just try and confuse what on earth's going on here. Not by you, but by the companies, the way they've been set up. If AIQ, they were being paid for work for the Vote Leave campaign and others, do you think they were working to a common plan for paid work to get a common result? Or do you think they were all been working separately?
I know that, well, sorry, let me, before I answer, are you referring to, which common plan are you referring to before I answer?
For the various leave campaigns, right, which was to get a leave result in the referendum.
So let me first say, it's just, I supported leave. Despite having pink hair and a nose ring, I'm one of the rare breeds of progressive Eurosceptics. I don't believe in the current Brexit plan, so just to clarify, but I do speak as somebody who, for me this is not about remain or leave, this is about the integrity of the democratic process, which is more important than anything else. Okay, so I just want to preface what I say. I am absolutely convinced that there was a common plan and common purpose with Vote Leave, Be Leave, the DUP, and Veterans for Britain. All of these companies somehow, for some reason, all decided to use Aggregate IQ as their primary service provider when Aggregate IQ did not have any public presence, no media, no website. The only way that you could find them on the internet is if you went to SCL's website and called up SCL Canada, right? So first question that I have is, why is it that all of a sudden this company that has never worked on anything but Cambridge Analytica projects, that had no public presence, somehow became the primary service provider to all of these supposedly independent and different campaign groups, firstly. And secondly, what I've provided to the Electoral Commission is 3 binders of evidence about this high, of emails, documents, invoices, chat logs, activity logs, system logs, screen caps of conversations that were happening inside of Vote Leave, in particular with reference to the Be Leave project, which was the single largest expenditure of Vote Leave, went to Be Leave. And when you look at the accumulation of evidence, I think it would be completely unreasonable to come to any other conclusion that this must be coordination, this must be a common purpose plan. When I went to Aggregate IQ's office, because I was, after BuzzFeed released their first article on isn't it bizarre that a fashion student who was 22 received, £625,000 in the last 2 weeks of the referendum, and isn't it weird that this Canadian company that no one's ever heard of received 40% of Leave spending? And having introduced Darren and Shamir to Vote Leave and having set up this company, I was genuinely concerned that that something unlawful happened. I mean, it doesn't pass the smell test. And when I went and actually spoke to Aggregate IQ, who were very, very pleased with themselves as how that project went, understandably they won. But I asked them. I said, "Well, can you show me actually what it is that you were doing? What was your secret? How did you And he's how did you win? What did you do?" And they conceded to me, and this is a verbatim quote, which and I stand by. I remember Jeff Sylvester telling me this. It was, quote, totally illegal. But they found it amusing because you have to remember that this is a company that has gone around the world and undermined democratic institutions in all kinds of countries, right? They could care less as to whether or not their work is compliant because they like to win. And when I asked them, okay, show me some of the work that you've done, I asked them, did you silo? Did you silo the data? Did you silo your advertising? If you're doing programmatic advertising, if you don't silo your programs into different campaigns, the results of one campaign will influence the results of the other campaign. And they said, absolutely not. It was all just one common ad program, which means that Aggregate IQ was just used as a proxy money laundering vehicle, right? What Dom Cummings did is he went around and found places that he could just launder money through to give it to AIQ so that they could overspend. And that is my genuinely held belief. And for me, it makes me so angry because a lot of people supported Leave because they believe in the application of British law and British sovereignty, and to irrevocably alter the constitutional settlement of this country on fraud is a mutilation of the constitutional settlement of this country. And you cannot call yourself a leaver. You cannot call yourself somebody who believes in British law and win by breaking British law in order to achieve that goal.
And is that your belief as well, that the law was broken in this?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I am so angry that that two people that I introduced in good faith that it's hard for a lot of young people to get involved in politics. And I introduced these two young people to volunteer on a campaign to Stephen Parkinson in good faith that that they wouldn't be manipulated and they wouldn't be used to break the law. And what is so egregious about this is that Darren was made to be personally liable for a criminal conspiracy, in my view. And it is absolutely outrageous that he has the amount of emotional trauma that Darren has been put through. Watching his mental health deteriorate, watching that Dom Cummings and Matthew Elliott encouraged him and eventually convinced him to quit university so that he could stay at Brexit Central, right? And when I talked to Darren and I said, I think that you should get out of this because I think you are losing your perspective as to what's happening. And I told him that I thought that he was being manipulated, particularly after all of this stuff came out. And he said, well, I've already quit university because they told me to quit university. And what am I going to do? I have no options. Everyone hates me. He told me that he felt trapped, and part of the reason why I'm speaking out, and part of the reason why Shamir is speaking out is in large part, irrespective of what you think about Darren's political stance on things, he was a young person that was manipulated and continues to be manipulated in my view. And what is so outrageous is that he is the one who is legally liable. He is the one being investigated. It's not Dom Cummings being investigated. It's not Stephen Parkinson being investigated. It's not Cleo Watson, also at Downing Street, being investigated. She was head of outreach. She was in charge of this program. It's not Victoria Woodcock, who went after being notified, 2 weeks after being notified that she was under investigation. She goes onto this shared drive where they were putting all of their advertising, putting all of their materials, and she goes and attempts to delete Dom Cummings, herself, and Henry DeZoot, the head of digital Vote Leave, after they were being notified that they were under investigation, right? And it's not them that's being investigated, it's Darren, the 22-year-old intern, who had no control over that spending and was just told, sign here, sign here.
Do you think these people that you've mentioned, not Darren, the other people that you've mentioned there, knew what they were doing, knew that what they were doing was in breach of the law?
So, Vote Leave's lawyers, okay, William Norton, wrote the Constitution for Believe. The entire process was managed by Vote Leave's lawyers. Okay, so Believe was set up by Vote Leave's lawyers. The entire process was managed by Vote Leave's lawyers. And as Shamir has commented on before, that created a veneer or a sort of a sense that that what Believe was doing, or what these two young people were doing, felt legal because they kept talking to the lawyers who kept telling them to do this and that. So they just assumed that, well, if the Vote Leave lawyers are telling us to do this, that therefore this must be the proper way to do it. This was their first campaign, right? They were volunteers. So I don't, although Darren is technically legally liable for what happened, morally I don't fault him.
If we put Darren to one side, the Dominic Cummings, all of these other people that you're talking about, do you think they knew that what was being done was not on the right side of the law?
Why did Victoria Woodcock, 2 weeks after being notified that they were under investigation, go onto a shared drive that Vote Leave set up and try to delete herself, Dom Cummings, and Henry DeZoot? Why did that happen? After being notified that they were under investigation.
I think we can speculate on that now. I mean, ultimately, this is a matter for the Electoral Commission, and if offence has been committed, then they will recommend action is taken against the individuals concerned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Simon, you have one quick question on this, and then Brendan.
Almost irrelevant to what you were just saying, but let's assume for a minute that the assertions you make are absolutely right. Have you or anybody else made any assessment of actually whether any of this made much difference to the final outcome of the EU referendum?
Okay, so 2 points on that. First point is, when you're caught in the Olympics doping, right, there's not a debate about how much illegal drug you took, right? Or, well, he probably would have come in first anyway, or, he only took half of the amount, or, doesn't matter. If you're caught cheating, you lose your medal, right? Because if we allow cheating in our democratic process, then, and we allow this amount, what about next time? What about the time after that, right? This is a breach of the law, this is cheating. And it's the thing that's really important to understand here is that this is not some council race or a by-election. This is an irreversible change to the constitutional settlement of this country. So that's, first of all, that's why it matters. And if you cheat on an exam, you get a fail. If you cheat on the Olympics, you lose your medal, right? You shouldn't win by cheating. First point. Second point, to the actual substance of your question, Dom Cummings himself says that this is what won Brexit for them. He says AIQ, they could not have won without AIQ, and it speaks volumes to the fact that they spent 40% of their budget on AIQ. Having seen the effectiveness of the conversion rates on the online ads that AIQ puts out, they are incredibly effective. They are incredibly effective. When you look at online adverts, and you can get programs with a conversion rate of 1 or 2%, right? You put out a lot of adverts, and a conversion, just so that people are aware, is not just somebody seeing an ad, and not only just seeing an ad and then clicking on the ad. It's clicking on the ad and then performing an action. So that's what the definition of a conversion is. So filling out a form, giving an email.
But are you going as far as saying that had these institutions not cheated, in your words, then the outcome of the referendum might have been different? Is that what you're saying?
I think it is completely reasonable to say that there could have been a different outcome in the referendum, had there not been, in my view, cheating.
Thanks. Sorry. Thank you. I just wanted to, before bring Brendan in, just to clarify a few things we've been discussing in this section. So from what you say, you've used the term sort of franchise operation. It seems like kind of mafia-style franchise operation of these different entities. We've focused on 3. There could be many more that are technically independent of each other, but they're totally reliant on each other as well. That their business is reliant on each other. And if there's one entity, is there one person who's responsible for that entity, do you think?
If there's one as in who's responsible for the whole sort of web of things?
If it's a franchise, then there's a kind of, ultimately there's a coordinator of that franchise. There's someone whose IP that franchise is.
Well, when I was there, that was Alexander Nix and Steve Bannon. But that's a question you should be asking AIQ.
Yeah. And just in regards to AIQ and the and GSR, the data from GSR, the Alexander Kogan data, do you believe that all the companies would have had access to that data that was gathered as well? That would have been accessible to AIQ, to Cambridge Analytica, to anyone that was working as part of this franchise?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's farcical to say that AIQ didn't have access to the Facebook data when they were building the software that deployed it.
Yeah.
You can't do online targeting if you don't have access to the database.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah. Thank you, Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Chair. One question, looking back slightly, you talked about the AIQ conversion rates. What were those conversion rates? You said they were significant, or more than significant. What were they?
I've seen conversion rate. So obviously it depends on the program and the advert. So there's not one hard and fast rule. But I've seen conversion rates, 5-7%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in online advertising, that's a very effective program. Because again, the conversion is not just somebody seeing the ad or even clicking on it. It's them going and performing an action, signing up, donating, performing a substantive action, or coming and attending an event. So performing a substantive action, and you'll get on online ads, a lot of programs that I've seen will get conversions of 1-2%, 7. I saw one program that they had which had a 10%. I mean, that was kind of an insane, but they had substantially higher conversion rates, at least on the American projects that I worked on. I haven't seen the work, intimately that they did on Brexit, but what they told me was that they had, they focused their effort. So AIQ didn't just advertise to everybody in the country. They focused their effort on 5 to 7 million people, right? Who were sort of the core universe that if you could turn out these people, then you can win. And so what they told me is they didn't advertise to everyone in the country. They took a very specific sliver of the country that they in a very calculated way that they needed in order to win, and they just blasted them with ads. You could find out because Facebook would have that information, Google would have that information.
And you say that 5, 7, up to 10% is absolutely unprecedented in terms of.
It's very for substantive actions like giving £20, signing up and going to an event, becoming a member, whatever that substantive action is, that is a really good conversion rate for people that you've never spoken to before, right? So this is not a retargeting. I'm not talking about retargeting. I'm talking about fresh people that you've never spoken to before. But if you target it in an effective way, and if you think about it, right, if you get a 5 to 7% conversion rate, and you target several, 100,000 people, and each of those people gives 10 pounds, if you count that as the substantive action, or joins and becomes a member or attends an event, that actually, when you scale it, becomes quite impactful.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you about the relationship between Cambridge Analytica and global science research? What was that relationship, as you understand it? What work did they do? GSR, that's Kogan's company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So GSR was contracted. There were several iterations of the Facebook harvesting project. It first started as a very small pilot, firstly to see, just most simply, is this data matchable to an electoral register? Because one of the concerns was, if you just collect somebody named John Smith, that could be anybody, so can you actually match that to this John Smith on this street in this city? We then scaled out slightly to make sure that he could actually acquire data in the speed that he said that he could. So the first real pilot of it was a sample of 10,000 people who joined the app. That was in late May 2014. That project went really well, and that's when we signed a much larger contract with GSR in the first week of June. I can't remember the specific date, but the first week of June 2014, where the app went out and collected surveys and people joining apps throughout the summer of 2014. In terms of which then ended up leading to the 50, the 50 million number is what is what the media has felt safest to report, but my recollection, because of the documentation that they can rely on, my recollection is substantially higher than that. So my own view is that it was much more than 50 million. But there, in terms of the relationship, there was a contractual relationship between the companies. If that,
yeah,
is that the?
It's good. I just wanted to follow on. I mean, now that we've established that there was this relationship, this contractual relationship, from Cambridge Analytica's perspective, was that a useful relationship with GSR?
Was that a use from Cambridge Analytica's perspective?
Yes.
Oh, incredibly! I mean, this is what built the company. Like this was the foundational data set that then was modeled to create the algorithms. So I mean, that was a very important relationship.
Again, the reason I ask that is because on the 27th of February, when Alexander Nick was here, he was asked, does any of your data come from global science research? To which he replied, we had a relationship with GSR. They did some research for us back in 2014. That research proved to be fruitless, so the answer is no. The chair then said, they have not supplied you with any data or information. Mr. Nix replied, no. The chair said, your data sets are not based with information you've received from them. He said, no, not at all. Does that...
$1 million contract? That's all I'd say to that. Well, why did you spend, the better part of $1 million on GSR? Why is there copious amounts of email, which I've passed on to the committee, the contractual documents, the invoicing, the match rates of that data, emails about that data. That's just not true. It's just not true. Sorry, it's not true.
You described, or you've been quoted as saying that Cambridge Analytica, we exploited Facebook to harvest millions of people's profiles and built models to exploit what we knew about them and target their inner demons. Could you explain just a little bit further what that means and even give a practical example of what that would have meant?
So when you're looking at psychological disposition, so no one is a perfectly rational agent. right? I mean, what in part makes us human is our irrationality, right? Otherwise, we'd all be just robots. And so different people have different dispositional attributes, so different personality traits, different degrees of mental heuristics or biases. So, for example, if you are able to create profiling algorithms that can predict certain traits, so let's say a high degree of openness and a high degree of neuroticism, and when you look at that profile, that's the profile of a person who's more prone to conspiratorial thinking, for example. They're open enough to kind of connect to things that may not really seem reasonable to your average person, and they're anxious enough or impulsive enough to start clicking and reading and looking at things. And so if you can create a psychological profile of a type of person who is more prone to adopting certain forms of ideas, conspiracies, for example, and you can identify what that person looks like in data terms, you can then go out and predict how likely somebody is going to be to adopt more conspiratorial messaging, and then advertise or target them with blogs or websites or various what everyone now calls fake news, so that they start seeing all of these ideas or all of these stories around them in their digital environment. They don't see it when they watch CNN or NBC or BBC, and they start to go, well, why is it that everyone's talking about this online? Why is it that I'm seeing everything here, but the mainstream media isn't talking about how Obama has moved a battalion into Texas because he's planning on staying for a third term? I keep seeing that everywhere, but why isn't the mainstream media talking about that? Not everyone's going to adopt that, right? So the advantage of using profiling is that you can find the specific group of people who are more prone to adopting that idea as your early adopters, as people who you can start. If you think about it in terms of trends, right? All trends start with a group of people who adopt something early. So if you can find people, if you can find those people in your data sets because you know what they look like in terms of data, you can catalyze a trend over time, but you first need to find what those people look like. Does that?
Yeah, but that tactic, was that routinely used by SCL or Cambridge Analytica? Was that one of the tools in the armory that was routinely used?
Yes, that was the basis of a lot of our research was what kinds of, how far can we go with certain types of people, and who is it that we would need to target with what types of messaging.
And can I ask, in accessing that data or getting your hands on that data, did Cambridge Analytica or SCL approach GSR, or was it the other way around? Were they approached by GSR?
Yeah, I've gotten this question quite a bit. It's sort of a bit of both, because we were already working with several professors at Cambridge. So first point that I would say is GSR actually became a company simply to serve as Cambridge Analytica, right? So GSR didn't pre-exist. Okay. We were already working with a lot of professors in various ways, just ad hoc consulting, that sort of thing, at Cambridge, which is how we got introduced to Kogan. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't as direct as like I sought out Kogan or CA sought out Kogan, and it wasn't that Kogan sought out us. It was just the fact that we were engaging a lot of the same people, and it was just through that interaction that we started talking. the first profs that we started working with were David Stilwell and Mikhail Kaczynski. But the reason why we stopped working with them was because they, so Mikhail Kaczynski at the time was the deputy director of the Psychometric Center, and he said once he found out how much money we had, he asked for $500,000 and 50% royalties, which he sent in an email. So that's I also provided that to the committee, which wasn't feasible on an experimental project to make that kind of commitment. And it was Kogan who then came and said, well, actually, I could do it just as long as you pay for the data and pay for costs, we can do it and figure out some kind of commercial deal after. So let's just see if this works. And so that's why Kogan ultimately was selected to be the person to provide those services, because Dr. Kaczynski wanted $500,000 and 50% royalties.
Do you know how much Cambridge Analytica paid GSR for the data?
So it depends on what you mean by paid for, because the way the project ran, for the most part, was SCL, because remember, all the accounts are actually SCL. So when I say CA and SCL, I'm talking about effectively the same thing. So it was technically SCL accounts that were paying for it. SCL would pay for the invoicing to Qualtrics or MTurk. So these were survey respondent recruitment platforms. SCL would pay for that directly. So not that much money actually was passed through GSR. A lot of it was just paid directly to Qualtrics or Amazon, MTurk, etc. The contract fee, GSR was paid money, because in order to make a valid contract, you need consideration. So they did receive 3.14 pounds, or pounds, as the contract fee. So, but most of the money that was spent went directly to pay for costs rather than pay Kogan. When I was there, I don't know exactly, because I know that Kogan stayed around longer, with SCL after I left. So I'm not sure at that point if he made a commercial deal or not with SCL. But when I was there, it was predominantly just a research project. The deal was that he could keep all the data and do research or whatever he wanted to do with it. So for him, it was appealing because you had a company that was the equivalent of, no academic grant could compete with the amount of money that we could spend on it. And also, we didn't have to go through all the compliance stuff that you have to do with academic grants and all the reporting and all of that. So we could literally just start next week and pay for whatever you want. And so my impression at the time was that for an academic, that would have been quite appealing.
Finally, much of the attention, quite rightly, is on Cambridge Analytica at the moment. Do you know other data analytics companies out there who are operating in the same way?
So when I first joined SCL, one of the very first emails that I got was asking me about a company called Palantir. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with Palantir, but it's a private contractor. Its largest client is the NSA. It also works for GCHQ. Alexander Nix was very interested in the work that Palantir did, in part because Sophie Schmidt, who is the daughter of Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, worked for Alexander Nix before I came on board and introduced him to Palantir. So when I came on, one of the very first questions was, can we do something with Palantir? Can we do something with Palantir? What do you think about Palantir? So we actually had several meetings with Palantir whilst I was there. And some of the documentation I've also provided to the committee, and there is more documentation that I still need to provide you on this. but Palantir, there were senior Palantir employees that were also working on the Facebook data.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick question from Rebecca Power.
Apologies, I have to leave, but I just...
Can I just clarify one point? That was not an official contract between Palantir and Cambridge Analytica, but there were Palantir staff who would come into the office and work on the data. And we would go and meet with Palantir staff at Palantir. So just to clarify, Palantir didn't officially contract with Cambridge Analytica, but there were Palantir staff who helped build the models that we were working on.
Thank you, Rebecca.
It was something you mentioned earlier, Christopher, and I wondered if it's related to some of the things my colleague has just referred to. You mentioned that in the elections around the world that these various companies, AIQ in particular, had been involved with, one of the main influences and the main way they made money was through influence brokering. I wonder if you could explain what that is. And I'm asking, is there a more sinister side to this? This isn't just about influence and affecting elections and the kick of the academic side. Is there a more sinister money-making side linked to all of this that we haven't yet uncovered?
Yes. So you don't actually make a ton of money working on politics, particularly in a small island nation, for example, right? But that island nation may have oil reserves, or it may have minerals, or lax labor laws that can be exploited by companies, or could have lax labor laws if those laws were passed. So part of the business model of SCL is to capture a government, so win an election. You get paid for that, but you don't make a ton of money. Where you actually make money is then going to the minister and introducing the minister to a company, and then making deals. I remember deals about there were different companies that were interested in building new ports or things like that, and in order to get a competitive advantage, if the money goes here, the money goes here, and then you can introduce the minister, and if the minister then approves the project, then you get a cut of that deal. The company also, so even, for example, when I was there, it wasn't just selling influence from a company to a government. Often they would use fake government projects to also then help support the political aims of the minister. So for example, Alexander Nix met with the Minister of Health of Ghana and offered her essentially to provide her with a large degree of political and campaign services, but they would bill it through the Ministry of Health as a health research program. And so they approved that. I've also sent documentation to the committee on this.
So can I just stop you? Earlier you referred to some of these very wealthy people involved in these companies. Do you think this is really what their driving force is, that they can be big power players on the world stage?
Yeah, you can be like, a colonial master in a country. Sorry, not to sound flippant about it, but it felt very much like a privatized colonizing operation. You would go into a country that has underdeveloped civic institutions, you would exploit that, and then make money off of it. And that's how they make a lot of their money, is through exploiting relationships and the fact that there's not a lot of oversight and government accountability in a lot of these countries. So it's very easy to make money off of that. The key thing is you have to have your guy in power first.
Thank you. Giles Watling.
Yes, thank you, Chair. You've told some pretty horrendous stories, particularly about the political situation in Nigeria, working on things there. And you've told us that Cambridge Analytica doesn't have staff, yet you work for Cambridge Analytica. Were you employed by SCL?
I was paid for by SCL. So yes, I work for Cambridge Analytica, as does everybody. Everybody works for Cambridge Analytica, but they're paid for by SCL.
Right, and you say...
And when I started before Cambridge Analytica even existed.
All right,
Yeah.
okay, and Cambridge Analytica came along, and that relationship which you've so eloquently described started, and so in effect you were working for Cambridge Analytica. Yeah. Now, you talked about all those malevolent influences that have been exposed in Nigeria, etc. And you're working for these people. And you signed, as you said, a non-disclosure agreement with Cambridge Analytica. Is that right?
With SCL.
With SCL. And can I ask you, now you've decided to go whistleblower on all this, are you under any threats? Is anything happening? What's happening in your world?
Do you know what's interesting? The most amount of legal pushback that I've got actually wasn't from Cambridge Analytica, it was from Facebook.
Right.
It's Facebook who's most upset about this story.
And how does that materialize? How does they threatening legal action or?
I mean, threatening. You know, they sent some fairly intimidating legal correspondence. They haven't actually taken action on that. I think. I'm not sure exactly what they're planning. They just have gone silent. They won't talk to me anymore.
So you're just out in the cold now.
Sorry?
You're just left out in the cold now.
Yeah. But I do anticipate at some point, you know, some robust pushback from Cambridge Analytica, because this is sort of an existential crisis for them. You know, but I think that I have a fairly robust public interest defense to breaking that NDA and that undertaking of confidentiality.
And you say that the Donald Trump thing wasn't the actual crossing of the line, but it was, if you like, the final straw in the camel's back when you decided to turn whistleblower.
It made it the most salient in my mind, as in it was no longer this niche, shady firm. It was a firm that, you know, was making a massive impact on the world. So it made it much more salient in my mind.
So your move was dictated by morality, questions of morality or illegality?
Yeah, I mean, there's no sudden, it's a process of coming to terms with what you've created and the impact that has had. I am incredibly remorseful for my role in setting it up. And, you know, I'm the first person to say that I should have known better. But what's done is done.
But it wasn't a road to Damascus thing. It was a gradual realization that what I'm doing here is amoral. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, yeah. There was no sort of, you know, there wasn't a sudden aha moment. You know, when I left, I knew that I was growing really uncomfortable with working at the firm for, you know, a whole slew of reasons. But I didn't report the firm because they kept threatening to sue me, and I had signed not just an NDA, but then this additional undertaking of confidence. And it's very intimidating to go up against, you know, an American billionaire who's threatening to, you know, sue you into oblivion. And that's why, you know, so when you look at, for example, Carol's reporting in The Guardian, right? So there's been a lot of attention on me because I've become the, you know, the face of it, because I'm the one that's come forward and put my name to it. But, you know, she has like 12, 15 other sources that she's talked to.
Sure.
And, you know, even now, right? Even now with you know, CA being exposed, and, you know, the future of the company sort of now kind of is in question as to whether it'll still be a company in a couple months. Even now, people don't want to come forward because that's how intimidating Alexander Nix is, that's how intimidating Steve Bannon is, that's how intimidating Robert Mercer is.
Mm-hmm. So you find yourself in the vanguard of it, but I mean, I put it to you, is there a part of you want to bring these companies down? Is that how you feel about it? You're angry, I've seen your emotion.
Frankly, yes. because these are nothing good has come from Cambridge Analytica, right? It's not a legitimate business. You know, STL is not a legitimate business, and you know so yes, I don't think that they should, you know, remain in business.
So that sort of clears up your motivation. Can I move on to Cambridge Analytica? I mean, do you know when Facebook first knew that its data had been passed to Cambridge Analytica? Do you have any idea when that happened?
So it's sort of, I know it sounds like a simple question, but it's actually a hard one to answer because I've heard different things from different people, and all of them are plausible. I remember when, and I think this was in around July of 2014, Kogan was delayed for a couple days because Facebook had throttled the app so that it couldn't pull as much data, or there was some problem with like pulling as much data at the same speed as before.
Yep.
And so he told me that he had a conversation with some engineers at Facebook. Okay, this is what, so I wasn't in those conversations, this is what he told me at the time. So Facebook would have known from that moment about the project because he had a conversation with Facebook's engineers, or at least that's what he told me. I don't know if that's entirely true or not, but that's what he told me. Facebook's account of it is that they had no idea until The Guardian first reported it at the end of 2015, and then they decided to send out letters. They sent letters to me in August 2016 asking, you know, do you know where this data might be, or was it deleted? It's interesting that Facebook, when the date of the letter is the same month that Cambridge Analytica officially joined the Trump campaign. So I'm not sure if Facebook was genuinely concerned about the data or just the optics of, you know, okay, now this firm it's not just some random firm in Britain, it's now working for a presidential campaign.
You said an interesting thing there. You said where this data might be. I mean, data isn't stuff that you sort of pick up and move. It spreads, but it remains in its source position.
Yeah, it's completely fungible in the sense that, you know, you can copy it a million times.
Yeah.
Right? It can go anywhere, and
so it's how far it's spread.
It's often impossible to actually ascertain, like, where did data go, or where is it, or how much of it is.
And do you know if Facebook ever made any efforts to retrieve data, to delete data?
No, they didn't. That's my knowledge. Certainly didn't with me, until after I went public, and then, you know, they made me suspect number one, despite the fact that the ICO wrote, you know, to me and to Facebook saying that no, I've actually given over everything to the authorities. So they you know, I suspect that when Facebook looked at what happened in 2016, they looked at it and went, well, if we make a big deal of this, this might be optically not the best thing to, you know, make a big fuss about.
PR thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you saw what happened last week, you know, it was a big deal. So I don't think they pushed it, in part because if you want to really investigate, you know, a large data breach, you know, that's going to get out, and that might cause problems. So they kind of, my impression is they've sort of wanted to push it under their rug.
So to put it in a nutshell, it wasn't in Facebook's interest to pursue the large data breach.
No, because also when you look at when you look at what this firm was also doing, right? You know, you had the professor Kogan, who was managing the acquisition of this data, was going back and forth to Russia, working on Russian-funded projects, which, by the way, CA pitched to other clients. So, you know, they knew what he was doing in Russia.
But was that you pitching? Or?
No, it wasn't me pitching it. So I've sent you copies of emails where other people at the company are deciding to put it into a pitch for other clients. And the fact that, you know, you had all kinds of people having access to the data, you know, staff at Palantir having access to the data, right? All kinds of people had access to the data.
So it wasn't locked down, it was everywhere. It was, okay.
Oh, it was everywhere, yeah.
If I may add something. Yes. So Harry Davis, the journalist at The Guardian, who published an article in December 2015, that's the moment where this story became a public story, or started becoming a public story. That's also my entry point into this.
Right.
But he has just published an article in The Guardian yesterday or the day before, explaining the genesis of that article for him. So apparently he knew of improprieties around data flows outside of Facebook already a few months after it happened. So something like, I'm guessing, around October 2014, let's say. And he started investigating, but he didn't know where the data was going. He didn't know what the use was, and so on. It's only later, because he got a tip that that Cruz was working with Cambridge Analytica, that he connected the dots and later published his article in December 2015, so much later. But my point is that at the time, you would have to ask with him, but somewhere between October 2014, a few months later maybe, he started talking to Facebook and asking Facebook questions about this data. And at that time, essentially Facebook was the only entity that could really trace the data because of contractual...
And as far as you're aware, they made no effort to do so?
You would have to ask him. But that's much earlier than I thought for a long time. It's only a couple of days ago that I changed my mind on this question.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Just so I can be clear on this use of the data that came from Alexander Kogan. From what you said, Chris Wiley, the data was used to build the algorithms that ran Cambridge Analytica. So the core data itself, once you've used it, once you've extracted the value you need from it, you've got your own systems then. So Cambridge Analytica say, well, when we were asked by Facebook to give that data back, we did. But even if they did do that, they've already used the data to build other systems.
You've created what's called a derivative product.
Yeah.
So the easiest way to think about it is, let's say you have a book and it's written in French, and then you translate it into English, right? It's the same information being conveyed, it just looks very different, or it could be even look completely different. It could be translated into Chinese, for example. Looks completely different semantic structure, grammatical structure, tenses, etc. But the same information is conveyed. So just because the data itself may look different, the underlying information is what matters.
Yeah. So in this case, even if Cambridge Analytica are correct in what they're saying in response to what you said today is that, well, we gave this data back, they may well have done, but the value they extracted from that data, they've kept because they've created something new with it.
The information.
Information.
Yeah, because the data is like whether it is, expressed in English or French, right? But the information is what it is that it's actually trying to, what it's conveying.
Yeah. And have you been able to benefit from that data set in other projects you've done outside of Cambridge Analytica, or does that data and the value that it was extracted from it remain within that company?
Sorry, as in, did I personally benefit from the data?
Well, no, so you were working on that data at the time when you were there.
Yeah.
And whatever was done with that. When you left Cambridge Analytica, were you able to benefit from the acquisition of that knowledge and data on things you've done outside of Cambridge Analytica, or did that stay very much as tools that developed within that company?
I haven't, I didn't do any contracts or any, work with that data.
After you left it?
No, I haven't worked with any clients that data was used for.
Yeah.
And as I recall, that data got deleted, I believe, in 2015 on my end.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Can I bring you in?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, Jay Stevens.
Going back to 2013, when you said you started out and you were introduced by a mutual political contact to SCL Group, I was interested in the initial article that Carol wrote in The Observer on the 18th of March. You said, I wanted to know why the Lib Dems sucked at winning elections, and that's how you kind of got into it and started looking at the issue. The introduction through a mutual friend in June 2013 to SCL Group, was that a Lib Dem politician?
It wasn't a politician, no.
No. Okay. You don't want to say to the committee who the contact was? The introductory contact?
I don't think it's relevant, and I'm trying to, anytime I bring up somebody's name, then the whole world sort of comes down on them, and there's conspiracies about all kinds of people, so I don't think it's fair on that person, because it was genuinely just an innocent introduction.
Okay, fine. And then I want to go back to what you were saying about the Vote Leave campaign and AIQ.
Right.
So we know, because it's in the public domain, that Vote Leave spent 40% of its declared spend through AIQ or on AIQ.
Yeah.
Yeah. £2.7 million. And in your evidence, you said that, and I just wanted to clarify this, whether you were talking about the referendum campaign or a different campaign, 5 to 7 million people were targeted by AIQ.
Yeah, that's what they told me.
This sliver of
like that it was that it might have been. You have different targeting universes, so that's probably to just clarify that slightly. They probably had a wider peripheral universe and a core universe, and you often have a universe, most fundamentally a persuasion universe, and then a turnout universe. Mm-hmm. So, but my understanding from those conversations was that they were targeting a very specific cohort of people. That they posited that if X percent of these people turn out, then you can win. Yeah.
Okay. And you also said that the conversion rate for AIQ was around 5 to 7%.
For some projects. Projects. Every project will have different conversion rates. There's some candidates that are just not sellable, right? There's some, right? It's not magic,
yeah.
Right? So if your candidate makes a habit of eating puppies in some sort of sadomasochist ritual, it's hard to sell that, even with really good targeting.
Yet, but, okay, so I'm just trying to work through in my mind. So we've got the targeted group of people, we've got a conversion rate, which you say for AIQ, they did quite well.
Yeah, and also just remember that a conversion rate doesn't necessarily mean, isn't necessarily turnout. That's like people who are performing a substantive action for your campaign itself.
Yeah. And we know that the Vote Leave adverts, online adverts, received nearly 1 billion impressions because Dominic Cummings has told us that in his blog. Yeah.
So that's how many people. That's how many views.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And in the end, the referendum result comes down to just 600,000 people, or just over 1% of registered votes. Mm-hmm. And he says, quote, a small enough margin that a few specific events and decisions made all the difference, unquote. So going back to what you said about, I think in response to my colleague Simon Hart, about this spend and this targeting and the outcome of the referendum, you think that it's perfectly reasonable to say that this could have made a difference, or did make a difference?
I think it's incredibly reasonable to say that AIQ played a very significant role in Leave winning. Yeah.
So that's the Vote Leave expenditure. What about Leave.eu? So this is Nigel Farage and Aaron Banks' campaign group. Did Cambridge Analytica work with them?
So just to be clear, I didn't work at CA when that happened, but I have seen documents. I think some of the documents may have been passed to the committee. There's also tapes, recordings of Andy Wigmore, for example, talking about how they used Cambridge Analytica. Gary Gunster is also on tape saying that they, played a role early on in the campaign. One of the things that you have to remember about CA is that they're very good at using these weasel words. So I've also seen invoices that said UKIP on them, right? So not necessarily Leave EU, but I've seen invoices that said UKIP. So they might go, oh, we started working for Leave EU and then we didn't, and all of that's, that's just, we were over-exaggerating or whatever, but then they may have also been working for other entities also. One of the other things that I've seen, which I believe Emma Bryant, the the academic may have passed on is documents from Eldon Insurance, which is Andy Wigmore's insurance company. Yeah. Those documents have, they're Eldon Insurance documents. So they say Eldon Insurance on the, like on the letterhead, or on, if they're sort of a presentation, so it says Eldon at the top. But then it's all about the response rates that LeavEU messaging was getting online. So I think one of the other questions that you should be asking to Eldon Insurance is, did you use your insurance data or your customer data to the benefit of LeavEU? And following that, was that data processed, or did that data, did Cambridge Analytica also have access to that data? Because what we do know is that Cambridge Analytica absolutely had a relationship with LeavEU. Some of the things that I've seen, which I believe have been passed on to the committee, although you'd have to check with Emma about that, are documents that also have Eldon Insurance, which would have a huge amount of data, because it's an insurance company, talking about the performance rates and conversion rates of LeavEU advertising. So I'm not sure, I'm much less familiar with what happened there than I am with Vote Leave. But some questions I'd encourage you to ask are, why is it that Eldon Insurance knew and was reporting on the conversion rates and response rates of LeavEU messaging? Did Eldon Insurance use customer data in any way for LeavEU? Did Cambridge Analytica have access to that data?
And as well as the Eldon Insurance documents, are there any other documents or evidence that you've seen that links leave.eu to Cambridge Analytica activity during the referendum campaign?
From someone else, I've seen, again, UKIP invoices. I also know that, Bannon was really interested generally in UKIP. He saw it as really important for America, because if you're fighting a culture war, Britain plays a key role in that, because if you look at the way sort of Americans imagine British people as, Britain is still like Downton Abbey, for lack of, everyone's sort of very, posh, educated, refined, and if you can instill a populist movement in Britain, in the American psyche, it's validating. If Britain is doing it, if Britain is Brexiting, then we can elect Trump. So very early on, and so for example, Matthew Richardson, who I believe is on the board of UKIP, if I'm correct, or don't quote me on that. He's involved in UKIP, but he's also Robert Mercer's lawyer. So there are significant links, but I would ask Andy Wigmore. What did you meet? Did you meet with Robert Mercer? Did you meet with Steve Bannon?
Okay, thank you. And you've also said this morning that you believe that there was unlawful activity during the referendum by Vote Leave. Again, when asked by my colleague. We're obviously seeing the ICO's investigation unfold here quite slowly, I think.
They just a point on it, because I've provided them with as much information as I can, but the ICO doesn't have a lot of powers. No. And also, the other thing is they don't have that many people. And so one of the things that I've witnessed is how much money and people can be spent on at Cambridge Analytica or at Facebook, and then looking at the small team that the ICO has, and the very limited resources that the ICO has, and the very limited powers that the ICO has. So it's not, in my view, it's not the ICO's fault that it's being slow.
I wasn't phrasing that question as a criticism at all, and I'm glad you've said what you've said, because what I was going to go on to
it's been very difficult for them. Because they struggle to get evidence, and they struggle to deal with, then when giving them the evidence. They don't have that many resources.
No, sure. I mean, if you think about what they're there to enforce compared to, say, a police force somewhere in the UK, their funding is tiny and their resources are tiny. And essentially, with the referendum, if somebody breaks the law, if the allegations that we've heard about are proven, then it's £20,000 to fix a referendum. And so that's not a disincentive to behave unlawfully. Would you agree
and also,
with that?
by the time, because these investigations take so long, even if it's found out, Brexit will already have happened.
Brexit's happened. The companies that ran the campaigns have been dissolved.
Yeah.
People have disappeared.
And what a shame it would be if that were found out, that there was pervasive cheating in the referendum and Brexit has already happened and we can't go back.
Absolutely.
And that's why some of these regulators, in my view, really do need to be properly resourced. Mm-hmm. Not just the ICO, but the Electoral Commission also.
Sure. Can I turn to something completely different now? You've talked about different countries where AIQ have played a part. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you about the Czech Republic. The Channel 4 investigation, the undercover investigation, executives on screen said that Cambridge Analytica and SCL had worked in more than 200 elections across the world, including in the Czech Republic. And I'm quoting from Mark Turnbull, a man with a plaster on his nose. We've just used a different organisation to run a very, very successful project in an Eastern European country where no one even knew they were there. Did you know anything about the work in the Czech Republic?
I've heard about the work in the Czech Republic, but I don't have any direct experience on it. Mm-hmm. But this is sort of what I'm saying about the role of AIQ and other companies like it, is that if you want a company to fly under the radar or not be noticed until after an election, after you've gotten out of the country, it's very beneficial to have this web of companies that are registered in different countries, that have seemingly independent operations that you can then use to operate under the radar.
Yeah. And you also mentioned in your evidence about Russian companies working with, I think, Alexander Nix.
Yeah.
And I know that in the evidence that you've made public, you talked about Alexander Nix doing a presentation to Lukoil.
Lukoil. I've passed this on to the committee.
You said it doesn't make any sense to me. If this was a presentation about a commercial deal, why were they so interested? Why were Lukoil so interested in our political targeting? And obviously there's a connection between Lukoil and the Czech Republic, because one of the former Lukoil executives
they paid for all the legal
advises
fees.
the new president of the Czech Republic. So what data did the companies that were pitched in Russia, did the companies that were pitched in Russia have access to data? What were they able to see and get hold of?
What I am a direct witness to is meetings, presentations, discussions, and conference calls with Lukoil. So I can't say one way or the other did data end up going to Lukoil. But the conversations with Lukoil surrounded two things. Firstly, Alexander sent them white papers that I had written, or sort of project write-ups that I had written about the Ripon project. So what kind of data were we collecting? What was our internal capacity like? How effective was it? And so a paper that just explains, we're profiling the American electorate. We can target them online. This is how we influence them. And then secondly, presentations from Alexander Nix, which I've also provided to the committee, which the very first slide is rumor campaigns in Nigeria, disinformation in Nigeria, attitudinal inoculation in Nigeria, undermining confidence in civic institutions in Nigeria. And those were the first couple slides that he gave to Lukoil, this Russian oil company. And the thing that I found bizarre at the time, and my feelings at the time weren't necessarily, it wasn't it wasn't, it was sort of suspicion, but not in a concerning way, just in sort of like, you know, what are you doing, Alexander? Because, you know, just something something naughty, not nefarious, if that makes sense. Because to me it didn't make sense, and he would refuse to tell me what this actual project was, because it didn't make sense to me. This Russian oil company wants to know about all of this data that we're collecting, despite the fact that we don't operate anywhere where it has an interest. Like, it doesn't, it's a Russian oil company. Why do you need a massive profiling project in America? That didn't make sense to me. And then also, what didn't make sense to me was why Alexander made such a concerted effort to show this company, you know, its experience with disinformation and rumor campaigns. You know, so I just didn't have, at the time I just thought, okay, well, there's something else up here, but I didn't think it was some kind of grand conspiracy or anything. I just thought, oh, it's just maybe Alexander is doing some deal or cutting some deal or some money thing or whatever. But it was when, you know, in the 2016 cycle, when, you know, this narrative about and evidence about Russian interference, particularly using Facebook as a means of, as a vehicle for propaganda, where I started to think, right, well, we were talking to a company that works hand in hand with the FSB. Alexander put in an email that he was sending my white paper and documents to the CEO of the company. So it's not some random person at the company, to the person at the very top of this company. And that we also made it known that the lead professor who had access to the harvesting applications was going back and forth to Russia and working on the project partly out of Russia, and also working on, you know, other psychological profiling projects in Russia. And so for me, that was concerning. What I'm not saying, and I'll be super clear, I'm not saying that Alexander Nix or Alexander Kogan or anybody involved in that knowingly colluded with Russia to undermine an American election. What I'm saying is that there was a very significant risk that was created in notifying this company, not only of the existence of this data, but the fact that in telling them that the person in charge of this data is actually operating in part out of Russia would make it incredibly easy for them to get access to that data. And for me, that's concerning, and I think that that should be looked into. It's not that there was, I'm not saying that there was, that I think, and my own view is I think that Alexander was being really stupid. They should have known better, because you have to remember SCL Group, you know, runs projects in the Baltics and Eastern Europe for various NATO countries on counter-propaganda, counter-Russian propaganda, and they also work on the NATO Stratcom training center in Latvia. So Alexander would have known that, given how closely we work on, you know, the border of Russia on projects that were funded by NATO members, in large part for counter-propaganda effort, that you know, and the Stratcom Center and all that kind of work in Latvia, that the company would have logically been an intelligence target for Russia. So if you're meeting with Lukoil, which very openly has a relationship with the FSB and operates in Europe where the FSB can't, and you are likely already an intelligence target because of the military and defense project work that you're doing in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, you know, and then you tell them that, hey, by the way, you don't even need to like hack into our data systems. Just put a keylogger on Kogan's computer in Russia and you've got everything. It's as simple as that.
Okay. You mentioned a professor in relation to that evidence you just gave. Who was the professor?
Kogan.
Kogan. That was Kogan.
Kogan.
Right, fine.
But
Okay.
but also when you look at Kaczynski, although Kaczynski didn't work on this project, Kaczynski was also going to Russia.
Right. Yeah.
He posted that he was going to do a presentation to the Russian Prime Minister.
Okay. And my very last point is just to go back to that Eldon Insurance issue that we discussed. Eldon Insurance deals with personal injury cases, substantial numbers of personal injury cases.
Yeah.
And the data that they hold would be classed as sensitive data under
Absolutely.
UK law. So are you saying that you think that there would have been a breach of that sensitive data in the relationship between Cambridge Analytica and Eldon Insurance?
So I'll be super clear. I don't know one way or the other what the relationship between Eldon Insurance and Cambridge Analytica is, but what I have seen, and I think has been passed to the committee,
is the UKIP, Eldon Insurance.
Is Eldon Insurance branded documents talking about the response rates and performance figures of Leave EU messaging and online advertising. So the thing that I find bizarre about that is first of all, why is Eldon Insurance making this report? And secondly, why do they have access to that data? And given that we know that Cambridge Analytica has had a relationship with Leave EU. I mean, they dispute the details, but what isn't in dispute is that they had a relationship with Leave EU. It's something that, so I'm not saying one way or the other that Cambridge Analytica had access to that data or that, anything like that, but it is something that is worth asking, Eldon about and Cambridge Analytica about. But or Andy Wigmore, like why was your insurance company making performance reports on Leave EU messaging? That wasn't declared.
No.
First of all, and second of all, were you using your insurance company's data to target people in Brexit? I think that's a fair question to ask.
So do I. Fine. Thank you very much, Mr. Wiley.
Thank you. Just while we're on Russia. Well, did Cambridge Analytica or SEL use any Yandex tools or Yandex cookies as part of their analytics work?
I'm not sure, so I can't say one way or the other.
Okay. I know this was a blog report saying that I think a Yandex verification meta tag was found on the Breitbart website.
Right.
I just wondered whether, given that, whether that was something you come across.
I mean, I know that CA has had a fairly close relationship with Breitbart, and I believe Breitbart was a client of theirs. I don't know if it's a current client, but I believe it was a client. But to the specifics of that, I don't have an answer for you.
Sure, thank you. I think Paul has a quick question.
Yes, just covering the foreign countries. You mentioned Nigeria. Can you just say a few words about what work you are aware that the company did in Trinidad and Tobago?
Sure. So the Trinidadian project was for several politicians. It was mostly a data harvest. We used it actually as a precursor to the Ripon project to see how much data could be pulled and could we profile different attributes in people.
Pulling it from where?
Online data sources.
Right.
So the contractual documents with AIQ's role was to go and find data. So the contracting is pulling ISP data, and there's also emails that I've passed on to the committee where Aggregate IQ is working with SCL to find a way to pull and then de-anonymize ISP data. So like raw browsing data. So the one of the other things that was pitched to the Minister of National Security there was related to some of Kogan's Russian research, which I've also provided emails on, about whether you could create a dispositional profile and then quantify that in data of people who are more likely to commit crime. But I didn't continue working on that project because I got switched over mostly to the United States. But I've provided documentation on Trinidad to the committee, in particular with reference to aggregate IQ, trying to acquire raw de-anonymized ISP data.
Okay, you've mentioned Latvia. I mean, I defy anyone to go to Riga and visit the National Museum of Liberation there and not just come out in tears and a broken heart about what that country, like other Baltic republics, have been through.
Yeah. And
particularly with the legacy of the breakup of the Soviet Union, that country, like the other Baltic countries, does not need any more tensions inflamed. So could you just explain a little bit more about what work, political work was done in Latvia?
Yeah, so just to be clear, that's not Cambridge Analytica, that's SCL, I believe it was SCL Defense, or some iteration of SCL.
So it's not political work?
So it's not political work. I know that, I believe Canada is the main funder of that, or I think the Department of Defense in
This
Canada.
Is the military side, so
it's focused on information operations training and capacity building.
Okay.
But also, my understanding was that they were doing counter-propaganda work in the Baltics. So, not, at least from my impression of it, nothing nefarious.
Okay, so there should be no suggestion that, as far as you're aware, they've piggybacked on the back of that to do political work.
Oh well, not necessarily, because I know that I believe in Lithuania they used some of their connections to do some political work in Lithuania. I believe, but my recollection on that is fuzzy. Okay. But I believe they have done some political work in addition.
I've just got one final sort of.
No, I'm sorry. They have done, I believe, political work in Latvia. I think I remember. I think I passed you a document that does reference that.
Okay, well, perhaps Latvian journalists can follow that up with their government. Can I just ask one more question? Just going back to Facebook's biggest user markets. If you make a speciality out of using Facebook and surveys, and I don't know how many Alexander Kogans there are who've worked with Cambridge Analytica, you focus on the world's biggest democracy with lots and lots of elections all the time, India, as being a prime source of business, wouldn't you? And you mentioned that they'd done quite a bit of work in India. Could you just describe what you're aware of?
I believe their client was Congress, but I know that they've done all kinds of projects, both regional. I don't think they've done I don't remember a national project, but I know regionally. I mean, India's
different states.
Yeah, I mean, India is so big that one state can be as big as Britain. But they do have offices there. They do have staff there. I believe I have some documentation on India, which I can also provide to the committee if that's something of interest.
Very welcome.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Another country that doesn't need any tensions in being inflamed.
Yeah.
Yes.
My understanding, relating back to the Romanian, your predecessor, Dan Harrison, so there are stories that are starting to come out, and the one in India of his involvement when he died later in when he died in Kenya. So he was working for Congress, apparently, according to reports from India, but apparently he was really paid for by an Indian billionaire who actually wanted Congress to lose. So he was pretending to work for one party, but actually really paid underhand by someone else. That seems to be the reports that are coming out now from India. So definitely on all this, there needs to be some collaboration between Romanian, Kenyan, and Indian journalists to piece out what happened.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Simon Hart.
Thank you. Very conscious that you've covered a huge amount of ground in the last few hours. So I'm actually just going to ask you to just confirm one or two things by way of sort of recap, just to make sure that I've understood you correctly, particularly around the area of the EU referendum. I think I'm right in saying that you have argued this morning and submitted by way of written evidence that you are convinced that AIQ played a significant role not only with Vote Leave but also other protagonists of the Leave campaign, and I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, and that you felt that those groups were somehow loosely or informally linked with one another. Would that be a sort of correct analysis of what you've said so far?
Yeah, so what I've submitted to the Electoral Commission is evidence that shows that there was a clear reporting structure. Leave was based inside of Vote Leave's headquarters, right? So, and they reported to, Vote Leave staff. Right. And so that's included in the evidence. So yes, not just a loose or informal relationship, it was actually quite a formal. It was not formal in terms of documentation, in terms of this is the reporting structure of Leave, but the fact that they asked permission and were working out of Vote Leave's offices leads me to conclude that there was coordination that wasn't declared.
You went on to say that Facebook became aware that data may have been being used by Cambridge Analytica for electoral purposes. Mm-hmm. Would it necessarily therefore be the case that Facebook knew that AIQ may have also been benefiting from that same data, or would that be stretching the connections a bit too far?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Facebook that. I don't know exactly what Facebook has done and hasn't done in terms of their investigation.
But I think you said that they were aware, well, clearly they were aware, we know they were, that that there was a data breach involving Cambridge Analytica, which has led, arguably to us having this conversation today. I'm just asking you really whether you felt that Facebook was aware of that close connection between Cambridge Analytica and AIG, or whether that is purely coincidental.
I don't know if Facebook is aware of the relationships between AIQ and Cambridge Analytica. Again, part of the intent of having a lot of companies around the world with different names is that it does make it kind of confusing and opaque as to who does what. It may also be that when Facebook went and asked questions to CA, that they just simply weren't told like a lot of the software development that actually happens at AIQ, not here. Which is entirely possible. So
we have further opportunity to question Facebook, so we'll obviously be dealing with that. The third point is, right at the beginning of your evidence, you suggested that, made it perfectly clear that you felt that CA and SCL, and I would add, and ask you the question, but that includes AIG, were involved in straightforward illegal activity, which you have submitted by way of evidence to the Electoral Commission. Would it be right to include AIQ in that?
AIQ played an absolutely pivotal role in the overspending scheme that was set up at Vote Leave.
So does that not make the role of Mr. Mercer you described as quite intimidating, some of the doubly serious? So you've got what you're submitting is very clear breaches of electoral legislation by some fairly substantial players, and coupled with that, intimidation by the guy whose name appears on this complicated graph in various significant places. Do you therefore think that Mr. Mercer should be subject to investigation himself?
Absolutely.
With regard to intimidation.
And it's not just legal intimidation, right? This company uses firms like Black Cube. And I'd encourage you to talk to Channel 4 to actually watch the footage of Alexander Nix talking about Black Cube, because they weren't unfortunately able to air it. But but that's an intimidating firm. If you work with Black Cube, that's an intimidating firm.
Right. Well, and my final question which was around Alexander Nix's undercover, the film of the undercover film taken of him, in which he was referring to the various different means that coercion may take place, including Ukrainian sex workers and all those things, subsequently denied. Do you believe that there was, I mean, how much significance should we attach as a committee to the denial?
To the denial?
His denial that they were quite happy to use coercion in attempting to achieve their electoral results on behalf of their clients.
My understanding was that that was like common practice. There's a bunch of projects that they've worked on. You know, you look at it's not just Nigeria. Like, you know, as Carol in The Guardian has also reported, you know, St. Kitts. There was a hacking scheme in St. Kitts, for example, right? This is someone else that you should be calling to committee is Brittany Kaiser, because she played a pivotal role in that relationship between Cambridge Analytica and Black Cube. She's touched on it in one of her interviews with The Guardian, but I'd encourage you to talk to her about some of that work also. Something to say about the Nigeria project is people, you know, I got incredibly panicked phone calls from people. They had to, because the relationship with one of the funders turned sour. They were threatened. Several people were threatened with their lives, and they had to like immediately leave the country. You know, the kind. You know, my predecessor was found dead. One of my other co-workers had a massive head injury and is missing part of his skull. You know, people do get hurt at this firm, and given that they work with, you know, Israeli private intelligence firms who are willing to do essentially whatever it is that you want them to do if you pay them. This is why so many people that, for example, Carol's talked to are genuinely afraid to come forward to talk about the firm because it's that intimidating.
Thank you very much. I've sadly got to go now, so it's not a reflection of the evidence you've just given, but I have to be somewhere else. But thank you very much. Thank you.
What is it? I mean, given what you said about Brittany Kaiser, what does it say that she was the Cambridge Analytica liaison with Leave.eu?
Yeah. So you have Brittany Kaiser, who sat at the launch event of Leave.eu, who worked on a project that involved hacking the now president of Nigeria, creating compromat, distributing videos of people being murdered, you know, and I think it would be a fair thing for your committee to do, to actually, you know, call her and ask, you know, what were you doing in Nigeria, and who were you working for, and why is it that you engaged the use of hackers to hack, you know, the now president of Nigeria? You know, it's something that I know that Carol will be reporting on shortly, is that some of these people who worked on this project, you know, also work in the British government now, and that causes me grave concern as to, you know, the relationship between this country and Nigeria. I mean, you know, and I've notified the authorities about this, and unfortunately, because the ICO and also the police, in fairness, because they have such constraints on the resources, haven't been able to fully investigate it. And so I would strongly encourage you to you know, ask Brittany Kaiser about that program, because you have somebody who worked on Leave.eu who worked on this Nigeria project. You've got AIQ who worked on this Nigeria project. I mean, this just shows what these people and these companies are willing to do in order to win. You know, and they all played an absolutely pivotal role in Brexit. You know, I think that's really important for people to understand.
I know that I think Chris Matheson wanted to ask some questions probably on that area. Brendan, if you don't mind, do you mind if we take Chris first, and then we'll come on to you. I think you were looking to come in around question 25, I believe, which
Yeah,
is looking on UK government work.
On 25. On the work done on behalf of the UK government?
Yeah.
Yeah. What, as far as you know, is the work that Cambridge Analytica is currently undertaking on behalf of the UK government?
I don't know if Cambridge Analytica itself,
or one of the associated companies.
I know that SCL Group or SCL Defense has done work for the Ministry of Defense, also for I believe DISTAL, which is the defense. I can't remember it's like the defense research agency for the UK.
Yeah. The UK version of DARPA.
Yeah, and the work that they've done for the UK government is centered around research on mostly in Middle Eastern countries to understand attitudes and behaviors of groups that could pose a risk to British society.
Is any data being collected on British citizens?
Well, the company has data on British citizens, but it's not necessarily that the Ministry of Defence is paying for data on UK citizens. Sorry, what?
Well, in terms of the work that the Cambridge Analytica SCL group of companies are undertaking for the British government, does that include data being collected on British citizens?
Not from what I have seen, but I do know, for example, one of the documents that I've passed to the committee, there's a quote from somebody who, until very recently, ran the PREVENT program, so I'm not sure. That doesn't mean that they worked on PREVENT, but I know that people who've worked on PREVENT also have worked with SCL on projects. So it's a question to perhaps ask the Home Office.
Okay. Is any of this data sensitive data in the way that we would consider sensitive data?
By sensitive data, are you referring to the government classification of sensitive, or are you referring to the DPA's definition of sensitive?
DPA.
Oh yeah, no, it'll all be sensitive data, yeah.
Okay, I've got some more, but I'll come back later then.
Thank you. Brendan.
One question about the involvement of, or do you know or are aware of any involvement of Cambridge Analytica or SCL or any of the associated companies in the Scottish referendum of 2014?
I know that Alexander pitched work in relation to the Scottish referendum, but I'm very fuzzy on the details of which side that was for and what the actual pitch was. So I wasn't immediately involved in that. But I don't recall, because I was there when the referendum was happening. I don't recall the company, just to be clear, working on the Scottish referendum.
Was there any work undertaken for either side by Cambridge Analytica or one of the SCL offshoots in 2014, do you know?
I know that meetings took place, but I don't think anything came from that.
Okay, thank you. Can I just ask Mr. DeHay about Facebook? I just, if you could give us a bit of background on your involvement with Facebook. I think you sought to try and get your personal data released, and it was to see why you decided to approach Facebook for your personal data, and to describe the challenges and the process that you had to go through in order to get it.
The easiest way to explain it was the question of Simon Hart earlier. If you know your data has been obtained from one company and you're trying to trace where it might be used again, then it would be a very effective tool if you could go to Facebook and ask, okay, who has my data? Who has told you they had my consent to be targeted on Facebook? Because Facebook might essentially help you, might snitch on all this nexus of companies that are exchanging data around. So, and it turns out that the law actually gives you that right. You can go to Facebook and you can ask a right of access for all your information held by Facebook. So that was my thinking at the time. And that's what I've tried to do. So I approached Facebook, I asked them for all my data precisely, for instance, custom audiences data and Facebook pixel data, which tracks which pages I've seen. And it was a very long process indeed. So I had to go, I'm simplifying, but essentially I had to go through, I tried through Privacy Shield, which is the agreement that governs transatlantic flows of data, because that data would have flown sometimes from Facebook Ireland to Facebook US. I also asked the Data Protection Commissioner in Ireland for assistance with all this. And it's a very painful process that took over a year to get all the details, to get all the recourse mechanisms through, etc. And the situation now is that I have a response. So Facebook partially agreed to some release of information, and the result was that the tool was changed. The data export tool was changed for everyone on Facebook. So now you can go and you can download the list of advertisers that have uploaded your contact information, which of course could be advertisers coming from anywhere. But I think that release is not sufficient because Facebook still holds that data, and I would like to be able to go back in time to trace. Throughout 2017, I've worked with journalists in 5 to 10 countries where there were elections. There were lots of elections in 2017, telling them, register to this mailing list because your data, if you register in this way, is likely to be reused elsewhere, and you might be able to use partial disclosures by Facebook to get more information. So, for instance, to be concrete, on the communication between insurance companies and Leave.eu, so the line of questioning was often, did insurance data go to the Leave.eu campaign? Well, I know that the converse is true. So when you get Leave.eu mailings, at the bottom there is an insurance ad for one of Aaron's Bank's companies. So he's definitely using the data set for other purposes. And then if you make it a method of inquiry, you can register to some specific mailing list, see how that information travels around. Journalists would love to use those techniques, but in practice it's really hard because just no one seems to see the interest of it at this stage.
So can I ask, what did you discover about yourself that they had?
Well, so Facebook discloses the list of advertisers over a span of 8 weeks on a rolling basis. So I personally had 200 advertisers that had declared to Facebook that they had my consent to advertise. One of them is Booz Allen Hamilton, which is an information company. I don't know how they got, why they think they have my consent on this, where that information comes from. I would be curious to ask, you could theoretically chain those requests. So you could go ask Facebook gives you a list of 200 companies, and you could go to each of them and ask again, okay, where did you get that consent? What other information do you have about me? And so on.
And I tried to do what you suggested this morning and couldn't. Mm-hmm. So I maybe ask you to show me. So you can only look back 8 weeks at a time.
That's correct.
So anything that happened 3 months ago, I couldn't find out who had my data or what advertisers were.
Not directly through the tool that Facebook has decided to implement following my requests.
Okay. Were you surprised with what you found out, both by what they held on you and also their reluctance to share what they had, or did you expect them to be quite so immovable?
No, I was actually surprised that they implemented something, because it's actually a recognition that I was right, that this data should be made available to me. But in a way, it opens up a gap. They implicitly acknowledge that, yes, they should disclose that information. I mean, you have to think that these databases are probably trolled through by a ton of intelligence services to now figure out what happened in all those different circumstances, right? And also by Facebook itself to assess what happened. So I don't see why I wouldn't have been able to do that organically by convincing journalists to investigate in this way literally years ago when I started looking at this.
So what excuse did Facebook give you at the time that they didn't have to tell you what data they held on you?
So this is a really long process. So at the time means only at the beginning of this month when things started to blow up. They're invoking an exceptions in Irish law around data protection in the data protection law involving quote unquote disproportionate effort. So they're saying it's too much of an effort to give me access to this data. I find that quite intriguing because they're making essentially a technical and a business argument for why I shouldn't be given access to this data. And in the technical argument, they're in a way shooting themselves in the foot. Because what they're saying is they're so big that there is no way they could provide me with this information. The cost would be too large. So one way, that's really the way they argue it. And it's not just about their user base being so large, it's about the number of communications. If you parse their argument, the number of communications that are exchanged. And usually that's taken as a measure of the dominance of a communication medium. So they're really arguing we're too big to comply with data protection law. The cost would be too high for us, which is mind-boggling that they wouldn't see, the direction they're going there. Do they really want to make that argument?
So essentially, what Facebook was saying was they are too big to be managed and to be controlled by existing laws, and therefore they almost should be exempt from them.
Yeah, I'm sure that if you dig there and you ask a Facebook executive, they would say, but we wouldn't be able to have the same business model if we actually had to enforce data protection law. I mean, I disagree because they implemented the tool as a consequence of my requests. So they made architecture choices in the way they built that tool, right? That's the first step. Then, in answering my request, they built a straw man saying, well, if everyone asked their data, this would be impossible to manage, for the whole history. So they build a straw man, and then they say, and the cost would be too high. Notice that they don't price the cost itself. They don't say, it would cost us this much. If they were starting to put a cost on getting our data out of Facebook, every tiny point of data, that would be very interesting to have, to compare with smaller companies, smaller social networks. If you think about how antitrust laws work, that's the starting point for those laws. So it's kind of mind-boggling that they don't see their argumentation and how it's going to hurt them at some point.
And the funny thing about that is that their argument is that we're too big to be able to give you your data, but our entire business model is on exploiting your data to make money. So it's sort of a bizarre argument to make because you manage to be able to use, they're able to use your data to target you and for advertising purposes, and that's fine. But if you want it, they can't give it to you because it's too complicated.
Yeah. Also, yes. So to be very precise on this, an advertiser can add my email address, my phone number, my Facebook ID, all those things to what's called a custom audience. And I think Sandy talked to you about all these tools. My understanding is that I would remain in a custom audience built by an advertiser for a full year. But Facebook only feels an obligation to disclose this on an 8 weeks basis. Yeah. I've built a whole document, a whole methodology for journalists to investigate those questions. I think it was in early 2017, knowing that there would be 15 elections across Europe in 2017. So I've proactively approached a lot of journalists before the elections happened to offer these as a tool. And they were enthusiastic, but at the same time, they know that those access laws for personal data are very difficult to get enforced.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just ask Mr. De Hey, and perhaps Chris Gualtieri has a view on this as well. We've spoken a lot about Facebook data, and it's been a pretty central part of the discussion today and the inquiry as well as it goes forward. There's been various speculation about the fact that Facebook can, through the Facebook app on your smartphone, listen in to what people are talking about and discussing and use that to prioritize advertising as well. There are other people who say they don't think that is possible, and it's just that the Facebook system is just so good at predicting what you're interested in, it can guess. But do you have a view on that at all?
Well, I'm not convinced it would be so hard to implement. But I just have a general comment that Facebook is so opaque that people start guessing, start clutching at straws at what explains all this targeting. Facebook is certainly, this has been documented, that Facebook is not I think I cited the evidence in my submission, that Facebook is purposefully hiding some of the targeting information that they would have to disclose by law. So if you are targeted based on 5 criteria, they will take the 2 least conspicuous ones, the 2 least bothersome, and disclose that to you, but not the other criteria.
Do you have a view on it?
My understanding of that's probably a question for Facebook, but just on a comment about using audio and processing audio, you can use it for. My understanding about how generally companies use it, so not just Facebook, but generally other apps that pull audio, is for environmental context. So, for example, if you have a television playing versus if you're in a busy place with lots of people talking versus something that sounds like a work environment, that adds. It's not to say that they're listening to what you're saying, so it's not natural language processing. That would actually be quite hard to scale, but it's to understand the environmental context of where you are, to improve the sort of contextual value of the advertising itself. But it's probably a question for Facebook. But just in terms of, it's not to say that all audio has to be somebody speaking. There's audio that could be useful just in terms of, are you in an office environment? Are you outside? Are you watching TV? What are you doing right now?
Yeah.
Along this line, there's a technique that has been documented that involves microphones and in the phones and ultrasound on TV ads or TV content, so that they can link what you have seen on TV with what you have seen on TV basically with a mobile device. There's some of this surveillance can be very unexpected, happen in very unexpected ways.
Is it right to say that the people who have a Facebook app on their smartphone, that app can gather data from other things you use on the phone, not just your direct interaction with Facebook?
Sure, yes.
Yeah. So other apps, other
like
tools.
your phone lists and your contacts and all kinds of things.
Your call logs.
Call logs, yeah.
Who you're calling, when you're calling.
But it depends on the operating system of the phone and the permissions. I mean, the same questions a lot of you had with Kogan and how data could flow from about friends' profiles to Kogan are tied to the way the permission system is structured and is architectured. And so, for instance, on iOS, it might be different from Android, more permissive in one than the other. And so it would enable a Facebook app on one operating system to collect more data than one on another.
Yeah.
My recollection is that Android is more permissive than iOS.
Yeah. Android's more permissive?
Permissive as to what you're allowed to do with an app, in terms of out-of-app collection.
Yeah. I must say that I think, given the extraordinary evidence we've heard so far today and the things we've heard in the other inquiry, I think it is absolutely astonishing that Mark Zuckerberg is not prepared to submit himself to questioning in front of a parliamentary or congressional hearing, given that these are questions of the fundamental importance and concern to Facebook users and as well as to our inquiry as well. And I think I would certainly urge him to think again if he has any care for people that use his company services. Julian.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Mr. I'm going to ask you just a technical question, if you like. I do notice in your bio, actually, it says here you enjoy working with journalists. I have to say, not even journalists enjoy working with journalists, in my experience. But what do you think would be the legal implications? You sort of touched on this with my colleagues' questions before, of an EU company processing raw data on a population at an ISP level?
Well, I think it would be a breach of data protection and privacy laws. And I think that's kind of, from my end, the start of this whole thing. It's when I read this article of Harry Davies in December 2015, I was very intrigued by the fact that, Cambridge Analytica, the trade name for actually a British company, was doing all of this in the UK, and I saw an opportunity, in a way, to shed light on the whole thing, because you have, 200 plus million Americans whose data is being processed openly by this company, and they think that because they have this, the shell company, Cambridge Analytica, established in Delaware, UK data protection law does not apply, but that's not the way it works. So I thought that was okay. That's a way, helping David Carroll that you heard and testify. That's a way to shed more light on this. But it's the same could be done from Kenya, from all of those different countries. Data protection is seen as a fundamental right in Europe. It's in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And so it applies, as Elizabeth Denham explained here, to this committee, it applies regardless of nationality or residence, as long as your data is processed in Europe.
Okay, so the likes of Facebook, for example, could not even start in the EU effectively. The likes of Facebook couldn't even start up in the EU almost.
It could, but it would have to be much slower and more careful, more careful in how it implements.
And more transparent, presumably.
Yeah, and more transparent and all those things. So, yeah, if it's a global playing field with companies that play fast and loose with regulations, that's definitely a disadvantage for European companies that try to respect European laws.
Okay. The way I think about it is, you know, data is like the sort of electricity of our new economy, and you know, electricity can be quite dangerous if there isn't proper safety protocols put into place. But at the same time, we all enjoy the benefits of electricity, despite the fact that it could literally kill you. But we enjoy it because there are proper safety protocols put into place, and architectural requirements and engineering requirements and all kinds of specifications on how the electrical grid is set up, what kind of wiring you can have in your house, etc. You know, the way I look at data is sort of the same way, that there are, you know, that if we started to look at it like electricity or like a utility of some kind, that you could, you know, regulate safety standards for data in terms of architectures and engineering, just in the same way that we do for electricity or road standards, you know, automotive standards. We do this in every other industry. It doesn't inhibit development of, you know, we still have cars, we have new cars, we have better planes, we have all kinds of things. It doesn't inhibit development. It just means that development has to happen in the context of safety. And that's sort of how I think about it.
There's a difference, though. There's a big difference. If I stick my fingers in the plug, I'll die, and everyone will see it. And if some accident happens, I'll die, and everyone will know, and there will be a lawsuit, and so on. And so the harm will be directly assessed very quickly, and standards change, etc. With data, it's different. It's really hard to evaluate the harm. I mean, even though, you know, the U.S., Obama didn't know the harm that would be done by hacking into voter database. That's the nature of information warfare. It becomes really hard to evaluate the harm relating to data. And so that's, even if you go to a much lower level, an individual level, what's the effect of a small data breach affecting me? What's the harm done to me? It's very hard to prove, or very hard to evaluate. And so as a consequence, the public understanding of data issues, the public understanding of the harm will be tremendously delayed compared to the actual, you know, source of the harm.
So in effect, what you're sort of suggesting is that a lot of these sort of big technological companies think that law should effectively bend to them, rather than they sort of bending to the law, so to speak. And that seems to be the mindset, that their answer to everything is, well, that will mean change our business model.
Yeah, I mean, they are effectively bending the law. As with Facebook and my efforts, it's basically I'm doing those efforts to be able to show quicker the harm that's relating to data harvesting, let's say, in different circumstances, because I know that this would have an impact further down the road, right? But they're effectively already bending the law, existing laws, in refusing to answer some of my requests. I mean, certainly I'm pushing buttons that are really annoying to, you know, Facebook and other companies, but and there is a reason why they're fighting it back.
Okay, Mr. Wiley, I just want to turn to a couple of points that you've made during your evidence. Just one thing just intrigued before, you sort of mentioned almost as an aside, you mentioned it a couple of times actually, that you'd seen one invoice or more than one invoice with the word UKIP on it. Is that right?
Yeah. I don't have it, but I've been shown.
You don't have it?
Yeah.
How did you sort of come into contact with this, and when did you come into contact? What are the circumstances?
Someone came and showed it to me. I can follow up and I can introduce you to the person who has it.
Right. So this isn't while you were at work, effectively. This is since.
This is since.
Right?
So people have come. There's lots of people who have come to me or come to Carol, for example.
Yeah.
Both before the stories have come out and then after the stories have come out. with more information in relation to the company. So happy to.
So UKIP named invoice from Cambridge Analytica is what you're saying.
Yep.
And you're saying, and any idea
and
of
to
time?
me, and to me, that makes sense given how there were UKIP members involved from the very beginning of the company, that they would just go on and work for UKIP.
Okay. And it's just intriguing to me because UKIP, quite famously, as most colleagues will now have absolutely no money whatsoever. So I'm just wondering when they were doing in terms of to actually sort of pay for this particular.
Well, you have to remember, part of the brilliance of Cambridge Analytica is that it doesn't need to make money because it's Robert Mercer's project, right? So Robert Mercer he's a billionaire, he doesn't need to make money, right? So, and further, if you as an investor of a company put money as a shareholder, as an investor into that company, that's not classed as a political donation, right? That's an investment in a company that you're the owner of, right? I'm improving R&D, I'm expanding our, teams, I'm doing, but you can do that more pointedly, and continue to invest purposely into a company so that it can also work for particular entities at a subsidized rate, or indeed, in some cases, for free. So one of the things that I'd also just point out is that just because there's a bill with a particular number on it with CA, it doesn't mean that that's the genuine value of the work that was produced. Because part of the brilliance of the setup that Robert Mercer created was that it becomes very easy to actually get around campaign finance laws in terms of declarations, because it's an investment. He's a shareholder; he can invest.
Well, what you're alleging there, though, is fraud. If an invoice is
I don't know if I should use the word fraud or not, but what I'm saying...
What the allegation is. You're saying
what I'm
basically
saying,
UKIP were receiving work from Cambridge Analytica
and
were being falsely invoiced for it.
Let me just back up there for a second. So I'm talking about generally how the company operates, particularly at the time. So I didn't work for UKIP, so let me just be super clear on that. I didn't work for UKIP.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But when the company was being set up, I was there at the creation of the company. So I worked with the lawyers, Robert Mercer's lawyers, on the actual setting up of the company. I've sent you guys the incorporation documents and all of that, all of the sort of company details of it. But one of the things that emerged about that setup, which was beneficial to Robert Mercer, is that the more money he puts into that company, the less money he has to declare in campaigns. He can say, look, if you've got $10 million, right, you can give it to a bunch of PACs. You then declare that. If you just put $10 million into a company, which then services those clients, you can charge a reduced rate, and you don't have to declare which money is going where. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see.
Because he's an investor, it's very opaque.
Yeah.
Because he's an investor.
Yeah.
So you don't have you can and it's like what happened with LeavEU. There was no billing that actually happened with LeavEU. And so something to ask is, if you did work, as Brittany Kaiser has admitted to, and as the company for an entire year bragged about, where did the money, there was some kind of incurred cost. You can't do work and just, as a company, not incur costs, not incur staff time, not incur data costs, not incur, what have you. So where did that money come from?
Okay,
sorry. On top of everything you've said, there's also the idea that, so there are other donors, not just Mercer and others. There are other donors that give money to pay for ads that end up collecting data that goes back. So this information, some of it at least, flows back to Cambridge Analytica and all this database they are building. And on top, the laws are more lax, at least in some countries. The data protection laws are more lax, if they were to respect them, in a political context. You can do more profiling in a political context. Yeah. So that's a way to get around some data protection laws sometimes. And this data then becomes amassed, and it's an asset that can be commercialized outside of the political context.
That's an incredibly good point, and that's an important point actually.
Yeah.
Is that there are lots of countries that give exemptions to certain data protection restrictions or privacy restrictions if what you're doing is for political speech or political campaigning. There's a rationale for that, which is that if you have to seek out consent to communicate as a political campaign, that might eventually sort of interfere in some way with sort of political discourse and being able to campaign, get your idea out. So not to get into that, but if you work in politics in countries that have much looser profiling restrictions and data protection restrictions because you're doing a campaign, build algorithms that are then repurposable in the commercial sector. Well, those algorithms now exist. Those profiles now exist. You were able to capitalize and benefit from the more lax laws and then exploit it commercially. So it's a very salient point.
Even more concretely, I mean, the electoral register in this country is only accessible for political campaigns. And then, politicians would get this electoral register, pass it on to Cambridge Analytica or other entities like it. That data set would be used to align different profiles from different sources, and this would be even legal because of data protection law being more lax for electoral purposes. But then the value of this alignment itself, which is part of what's difficult, would remain an asset of Cambridge Analytica that they're free to commercialize in other countries. So just for the record, I think this is what happened partly in France during the presidential election.
So you're suggesting basically this...
Not Cambridge Analytica, but that this workflow was replicated, that I'm describing, happened in France during the presidential election.
Just to drill down, really, I'm sorry to labour point this way, but I mean, what you actually sort of outlined right at the start, effectively, is an extremely serious allegation, and that is that effectively, that let's say that Cambridge Analytica were carrying out £50,000 worth of work, or only invoicing for say £5,000. What evidence do you actually have to support that particular allegation that there was a systematic, at Cambridge Analytica, effectively, false invoicing? Is there any evidence?
In terms of documentation, no, in the sense of it. I don't have documentation that says, from Robert Mercer saying, we're going to, that I'm going to set up this scheme. It was from my discussions with the lawyers and from my observations when we were setting up Cambridge Analytica itself. One of the points that emerged from that is that he was putting in $10 to $15 million US to create an asset that then we were licensing for £50,000 in some cases, $50,000 in some cases, right? So if you see my point about the subsidy, is that he can put in $15 million to create something and then only charge $50,000 for it.
Okay.
Even though, and that $50,000 would have been physically impossible to get the same value and level of service and data for that amount of money in any other way. So
you mean you'd have to build it yourself, effectively?
What I'm saying is that in creating CA and continuously putting in investment, he is subsidizing the work of CA to the benefit of parties and candidates that he supports, because they do not pay for the full value of what they receive.
Right.
If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, no.
And but he doesn't have to declare the full value of things because he is putting in money as an investor.
But this you mentioned an invoice, and you said that someone had come to you after you left CA, and is showing you an invoice with UKIP mentioned.
Yeah.
And that invoice you're willing, or at least you're willing to...
I can introduce you to the person that showed it to me. I don't have it, I know the person who has it.
Yeah, I remember you saying, thank you in that regard. Now, you said earlier in your evidence that you became incredibly remorseful about your sort of role in this particular industry. Was this before or after you offered your data harvesting techniques to Vote Leave in January 2016?
Sorry, can you say that again?
You said you were incredibly remorseful. Did you become incredibly remorseful before or after you offered your data harvesting techniques to Vote Leave in January 2016?
Well, in terms of what I offered, I didn't offer anything that was illegal. Or,
No.
So so I don't. Let me be clear. I don't have a fundamental problem with using data for targeting, right? I mean, I've built, I've spent a lot of time working on it, and there are ways that you can use data in a way that respects consent of people, that is transparent so people are aware that you are sending them a political message or a commercial message. Why is it that they're being sent? You can do targeting in an ethical way. But to your point, at that time Trump hadn't been elected, and I hadn't really seen the full, scale of what CA was to become, because that conversation happened at the end of 2015, or I think the document that you're referring to was given at the beginning of 2016. But that was unrelated to Cambridge Analytica.
What, your pitch to Vote Leave?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. When you say it was unrelated, you mean it was because it was your own company that you actually went, you approached Vote Leave and you said, I want to help you. It was your own company, not CA. But were you using, for example, did your company ever have access to the Facebook data that Cambridge Analytica and SCL is alleged to have acquired? Did you ever have that evidence?
Yeah, I did have access to it, but I deleted it.
Right. You deleted it?
Yeah, I deleted it. And I
when did you delete it? Was that January 2016? Was that when you were...
No, deleted it before, in 2015, early on in 2015.
Right, okay.
I didn't have that data in 2016. And that data, the specific data set that you're referring to was on predominantly US citizens.
Yeah, 30 to 80 million adults, I believe.
Sorry, say that again?
30 to 80 million. The data contains approximately 30 to 80 million or more unique records with information from online sources about named individuals. And the data includes forename, surname, date of birth, gender, location, online sources, system-generated unique ID numbers, all social network information on all interest categories. Effectively, was this the information you were going to Vote Leave with in January 2016?
No, because I didn't have any UK data. I couldn't physically offer. So if you actually look at the proposal, right, it's a pilot project to see if they could even collect data, right? So just to be super clear, what was sent to Dom was a proposal to see if they could do a pilot program where they could, the thing that I said to him is I said, look, I don't know if you can actually recreate, and I was very skeptical that they could, recreate a kind of equivalence of Cambridge Analytica in the amount of time that they had, just practically. You have to remember, even using, just for argument's sake, so I'm just being super clear, this is not proposed to Dom Cummings, but for argument's sake, right? Even if you used the Kogan app, even if it still existed, and even if I had access to it, to collect that 50 million records, that started, we started using the app at the end of May, and that full collection didn't complete until September, right? So if you were doing that during the period of the referendum, let's say, just for argument's sake, that you were to use it.
Yeah, but Mr. Wiley, you proposed this before the referendum had been called. You proposed it in January, and in fact, Dominic Cummings' response to you was, let's talk again if it's going to be 2017. So effectively, what I put to you is that you were basically saying to the Vote Leave campaign, I can sort of do what's been going on in the United States with all this collection of data in the UK. Let's have a conversation about it. Is that a fair estimation of what went on?
Yeah, that's fair. I had I haven't obscured the fact that I met with Dom Cummings. This is also in part why I know what Dom Cummings wanted to do. Data was really important for Dom. But I didn't end up working on Vote Leave. I wasn't even in the country when the referendum happened. And the proposal that was sent again, if you actually look at it, it's a pilot proposal, right? That talks about, you know, collecting, I can't even remember how many records, but it wouldn't have amounted to anything near even a million records. What I said to him is, I said, we can try doing some data collection, but again, I was skeptical that given the time constraints that they had, or likely would have had, I know that the referendum hadn't been called, but everyone suspected that it would sort of be sometime in the spring, and that didn't strike me as a feasible timeline, given that they didn't even have the electoral register. But nothing came of that.
But why were you trying to pitch then? If that's what was going to happen, why were you trying to pitch? I've got one more
because he asked me to. Like, it was, look, I did it, right? So I go, I have a meeting, I knew Stephen, and I have a meeting with Dom, and they ask, okay, well, can you send me your thoughts on what could be feasible? And that's what I sent, and nothing came of it. I mean,
yeah, because you rejected it. Now, Dominic Country described you as a charlatan. That's very unfair. Clearly, you're an incredibly knowledgeable man with huge experience and real insight into the industry. But isn't a better description, possibly, is a sort of a failed Alexander Nix? Basically, what you've tried to do is you tried to set up on your own, and then it hasn't worked out after, and you pitched to vote leave, and they've said no to you, and now you're hearing from the committee.
I don't take that personally. I did, you know, all kinds of other projects. I don't consider myself a failure, and in fact, you know, not to toot my own horn, but you know, I'm here on a Tier 1 exceptional talent visa that, you know, the British government only gives to 250 people, you know, a year. So I don't think I am a failure, and
No, the point
I am not. I was not. So, I was not.
You tried to set yourself in business effectively as a sort of, a type of Cambridge Analytica, hawking your wares to vote leave, and they said no to you, and then here you are in front of the committee, effectively sort of saying and making many suggestions about Brexit and the vote around Brexit.
Sure.
So I think it's a very legitimate question to wonder about your particular sort of
I wasn't
motivation.
so devastated by, you know, you have lots of meetings and it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't so you know. Sorry, Dom, but I wasn't so devastated that I couldn't work with you, that I've spent a year and a half on a vendetta to get back at you for a pilot project that didn't work out. Right? I did it as a favor. I gave him a write-up. Most of that was just stuff that I already had, you know, pre-written, sent it to him. He wasn't interested. I was back in Canada, so I was already working on a different project, so I don't even know if I could have even done the project even if he had said yes. So, I mean, I don't know what else to tell you, but I don't think I'm a failure, and that, you know, Dom rejecting me over a small pilot program hasn't devastated to me in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ian Lucas.
Can I ask you about something you said just recently? You said that you deleted some data. Where did you get that data from?
Sorry?
You said in an answer a couple of minutes ago that you deleted the data that you had.
Because I had access to the data that was collected during the Ripon project.
So was that the data that Cambridge Analytica had? And that
I had access to the same data.
So this is the Facebook data?
Yeah.
Essentially. So you had it, and you deleted it?
Yeah.
When did you delete it?
Sometime in 2015. I don't remember the specific.
So why did you delete it?
Well, because, like, I wasn't going to do anything with it. It wasn't like Kogan sent me a message saying that he didn't want me to use it, and I said okay, and that was that. And then,
but that was incredibly valuable data.
Well, yes, but at the time I wasn't even working in, you know, American projects. Like,
just so I'm clear, is this the same data that Cambridge Analytica had that Facebook now say that they wanted them to delete?
Yes.
So it's the same data, and you deleted it. Did Facebook ask you to delete it?
They asked a year later in 2016 to confirm that I did.
Right.
So I then sent a confirmation that I had deleted it.
So did Facebook contact you again about it, or did they just accept your word for it?
They accepted that, and I followed up to make sure that they were satisfied with that. They were.
Yeah.
So it was only they only started actually doing anything about it when they found out that The Guardian and New York Times were going to be publishing on the scheme.
Did they contact you again at that stage?
Yeah.
Or was that when they were getting heavy with you, you said earlier on?
Yes. Yes. They only started getting heavy with me, to use your words, when they found out that I had gone to The Guardian and the New York Times and the Information Commissioner's Office about the scheme.
So they were aware that, I mean, when Facebook gave evidence to us, I think on February the 8th, and in the United States actually, and they were aware at that time that you had, along with Cambridge Analytica, their data in 2015, 2016. They were aware of that.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I'm sorry.
So on
just be absolutely clear. They gave evidence to us on February the 8th.
We're talking this year.
This is this year, on February 8th of 2018. At that time, they were aware that their data had gone to Cambridge Analytica and had gone to you. You had deleted yours, and we know.
I mean, there was lots of people who had access to it. I'm the only one who's owned up to it.
You see, the reason why I think this is important is because I saw an interview that Mark Zuckerberg gave to, I think it was the BBC.
Sure.
I saw it recently. It was in 2009.
Sure.
And he said that the data that I give as a Facebook user to Facebook is personal to me, and unless I consent, it won't be given to a third party.
Well,
that's the fundamental rule of Facebook, isn't it? That's what Mark Zuckerberg said.
Well, I mean, there is a lot of mental gymnastics that you have to go through in order to.
Well, that's what he said. I can show you the interview.
Sure.
And he says that he will only share it with a third party with consent. We come to what Mr. DeHaye said.
Yes, but their interpretation of consent is that because you consented to be on the platform.
But it's not just about Facebook rules. It's also about the law.
Yeah.
Because the law says in the UK that you can't share data unless with a third party without the consent of the person involved.
But to be more precise, I mean, they would argue that their privacy settings, both on the source and the friends, would make clear of this transfer. So preemptively, as a friend of a potential source, you've agreed for those people to share data with third parties on your behalf. You've delegated the consent mechanism. You've consented to delegating the consent mechanism to a friend, essentially. Yeah. And that's their legal fiction of.
But Mr. DeHaye, they are the only people who know who they've delegated that consent to, because they have the records. Facebook have the records. No one else has them.
Well, yeah. So
they won't give them to you, for example.
So Mr. Zuckerberg checked in their databases that they did have the information to notify individually people whose data had been leaked through that scheme. I'm not sure they are the only ones to have that information. I mean, this data set has flowed around, has been used in different places. Others might be able to say whose data was pulled out.
But my point is, you can't get that information at the moment because they say that it's too much trouble, basically.
Yeah, so I was asking something slightly different, but I'm sure that if I had asked Facebook a year ago, was I a friend of someone who decided to give my data to Cambridge Analytica, it would have been a really hard process to get that information out. And I'm basing this on the fact that I've made many such requests over time, and that it's just a really painful process.
You see, what I can't understand in any of this with Facebook is why it was that 2 years ago, when they discovered that there'd been this catastrophic breach in terms of the sharing of Facebook information with third parties, they didn't actually act decisively the way they did last Monday night when they sent one of their, I think it was their lawyers round.
They actually, a week before publication, they threatened to sue The Guardian over the use of the word breach, actually.
Yeah.
And then they tried to spike the story for the Guardian and the New York Times by creating this press release and giving it to some other newspapers to try to get ahead of the story. They actually they threatened the Guardian with a lawsuit over revealing it.
And just so, unless Harry Davies was sitting on the information he had for a while and not acting as a reporter asking for comments from Facebook, so he would have had to sit on this for 6 months. And even then, it would already be 3 years that Facebook knew about this, because I would locate it at the beginning of 2015, not December when his article came out.
Yeah.
So that's a long time. Yes.
And talking of spiking stories, Mark Zuckerberg, according to the press today, appears to be saying that he's not coming to this committee, even though he didn't say so in the letter that has been sent to the committee today. And he wants to send a junior. Do you think it would be right for Mark Zuckerberg to come here to explain why there are these deficiencies at Facebook?
Is that a question for me?
For both of you.
Well, I'm owning up to it.
So it's about time Mark Zuckerberg owned up.
I went to the authorities well before this got, reported to in the press. I've, made my involvement known and taken my share of responsibility personally for the project. And tried to make amends in whatever ways that I can. So working with the authorities, or indeed working with the New York Times and the Guardian and the Observer and Channel 4 to make people aware of it. So I've spent, I think, better part of a year, almost a year, trying to work on this. I think the least that, given the reaction to the public reaction to the story, and even looking at it from just their share value, having a meeting is sort of the least that you can do.
Mr. Day?
Well, I think so. I'll draw a parallel. At individual level in data protection law, there is the right of access that allows any individual to basically make sure that their information is treated fairly. That's the basic mechanism we have at individual level. But I think this whole story shows that there is a collective interest in protecting data, assessing how it's used, and all those things. And I think you represent that. The enforcement mechanism, it's not quite the enforcement, but the proactive mechanism here to make sure that that collective interest is defended. So I think it would make sense to address direct questions to Mark Zuckerberg in whatever way is appropriate, and to get direct answers from him as representative of his company.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Christy, do you have a final question?
We're running late, so I'll just do a few quick fire ones. You've both been in the giving evidence for quite a while now. Did any data ever get leaked from Uber?
I'm sorry?
Uber.
Not to my knowledge.
No. Have you ever come across any data leaks from Uber?
There's going to be there was a big data breach.
Oh, sorry. I thought. Are you asking in reference to Cambridge Analytica, or are you asking in general?
Yes, but I mean there was a data breach.
Yeah.
Wasn't there? Did Cambridge Analytica ever use the?
To my knowledge, sorry, I was answering in relation to Cambridge Analytica. To my knowledge, Cambridge Analytica hasn't used Uber data.
Okay, Mr. Hay, did you want to add to it?
There was a leak of, I think, 57 million people's data from Uber.
Yeah.
So you have to understand that once that leak happens, for a while the data remains in a very small circle, and progressively it expands, becomes commercialized. So basically any kind of actor could get a hand on this data after a while.
Okay, thank you. Can I just go back to the questions that Ms. Stevens was asking about the operations in the Czech Republic, Mr. Wiley? Can you recall which candidate or party they were supporting?
I didn't work in the Czech Republic, so
no, did you pick up? Did you glean anything about who you might be supporting?
You'll have to ask Cambridge Analytica that. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, did Cambridge Analytica or any of its associated companies ever use the targeting tactics that you've outlined today to spread Russian disinformation?
I am not personally. I haven't personally witnessed the actual deployment of Russian propaganda by the company. But what I have witnessed is the company, very eagerly pitching its services to companies that have close connections to the Russian FSB.
Such as Lukoil.
Such as Lukoil.
And I mean, in the Lukoil instance, I don't think that went anywhere, did it?
No, but you don't necessarily. I won't speculate. So,
okay. Were there any other Russian contacts where it perhaps went a little bit further?
There, not to my knowledge.
Okay. Were Cambridge Analytica or any of its SCL or any of the associated companies in contact with Russia during the United States presidential election?
Were
they in contact with Russia during the United States presidential election?
You will have to ask them that.
Okay, were you aware?
Because I stopped working before the Trump campaign itself. So you'll have to ask the company that.
Is it the case that on the Channel 4 program, Alexander Nix said that Cambridge Analytica replied on an encrypted email system that deleted that deleted two messages messages 2 hours after they were read, and that's correct, is it?
Yeah. So I mean, there's all kinds of Proton Mail is a common. It's not just unique to them. Lots of people use it, but there's a lot of communications technologies that you can use to, delete or obfuscate your contacts. Just a point about that is that like a lot of people who care about privacy, for example, may use Proton Mail or Signal, or what I use Signal, for example, that automatically deletes stuff after a certain amount of time.
Okay.
So yes, the company has used various technologies that delete communications and whatnot. But just to point out more broadly that those technologies aren't necessarily nefarious. Often they're privacy-centric technologies also. So you can use it to obfuscate what you're doing, but you can also use it for privacy reasons.
Okay. Finally, are you familiar with the phone app which was provided by Campaign to vote Leave, which I understand was also used by the Trump and Cruz campaigns, which scrapes data from the user's phone?
Yeah, I've heard about it. I didn't directly I know the app that you're referring to. I didn't directly sort of use or work on that particular app, but I got introduced actually to somebody just the other day who said that they had more information on it, so I could pass on a contact if you'd like to know.
If you want to pass it on to the clerks, they would find it useful. I understand that at the time of the referendum, it would have had access to Facebook contacts. Are these the kind of data that you would have been working with through AIQ and Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah, Facebook data was absolutely a core part of what we operated on. So if it pulls Facebook data, then quite possibly yes.
Okay.
But I'll just comment. I haven't worked intimately with that app, so other people probably know more about the workings of that app than I do.
Mr.
So as people investigate this, you have to understand that there are layers of data collection and data processing and so on. So there is a theoretical possibility that Cambridge Analytica uses existing tools or existing sources to source all this data. But that's actually not what's happening. When you go back, you realize that it's players that are intimately linked to them that are building the tools precisely to collect this data. So in my mind, it opens the possibility that Mercer or others are behind also the data collection tool. And then this data is already collected earlier and might go into different directions later. So it's really a difficult job tracing this data over time.
Thank you. And then finally, Chair, if I may, I'm just reading on the Guardian website that Dominic Cummings has posted an update to his blog in which, and I think he's talking about you, Mr. Wiley, apologies to you and to him if he's not. He says that the Observer will look really silly for making a hero out of a fantasist charlatan. I don't know whether that's whether you want to make any comment on.
Can I just point out that I've worked with the Information Commissioner's Office to provide detailed information and documents. I've worked with The Guardian and The Observer, The New York Times, and Channel 4 there has been so much fact-checking in what I'm saying. Okay, so he might call me a charlatan or a fantasist, but if he's doing that, he is also calling The Guardian, The Observer, Channel 4, The New York Times, and the Information Commissioner's Office fantasists.
Thank you.
Do you think Dominic Cummings had any idea what sort of people he was getting involved with?
Well, all I can say is from my conversations with him, he was very familiar with Cambridge Analytica. He was very familiar with Robert Mercer. He even knew about Renaissance Technologies. So all I can say is that from my conversations with him, I know that he was following and aware of these companies, but that's probably a question better placed to him.
Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to check whether I'd misheard. When you were referring in shorthand to SCL, Strategic Communication Laboratories, that's plain and simple. But I thought I heard that when you were referring to Cambridge Analytica in shorthand, it wasn't just CA, but it was CIA. Is that what they call themselves?
Sorry, no.
Is that what they call themselves inside?
If I said that, I apologize. That was a slip of the tongue.
Right, CA.
CA.
Okay. Not CIA.
Not CIA.
Okay.
No.
I don't want to take the Walter Mitty bit too.
Yeah. So if I said that, I apologize. That was a slip of the tongue.
Okay. Thank you. Finally, I just wanted to ask about the UK Data Protection Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. The committee's received evidence from the Information Commissioner herself that her powers should be tightened so that she's got the ability to go straight into organisations where they've not complied with the data notice and that data needs to be served up, so that we avoid the problem we had last week where it takes days to get a warrant for the Information Commissioner to go in. Do you think, given your, the knowledge you both have of these issues, do you think we do need to give the data monitors, the ICO, the power to go into companies that hold data to see what they're doing? Otherwise, how could we possibly know that they're complying with the data protection laws?
So I think that actually the first point of the first place where there should be action is on the right of access and enforcement and facilitate that, increase budgets and all those things. I actually filed a complaint or sent a letter to the Information Commissioner in August 2016, so a long time ago, to the ICO, asking them if they were investigating Cambridge Analytica because of all the public information that was already there. It's my strongly held belief that if the right of access was made much more efficient because of increased staffing at the ICO and so on, then this right would be adopted by a lot more people, by educators, by journalists, by activists, by academics, as a tool to connect civil society with the commercial world and help document what's happening. So it would be much more effective. So that would be my first point of action.
Do you have a view of this tool?
So I think there needs to be a wider discussion just in general about what is data protection and how do we, I don't think there's an either or in terms of total restrictions on data and a free-for-all of data. I think there's potentially a discussion to be had about really actually understanding what do we mean by data protection. But just from my own experience having worked with the ICO over the past couple of months, one of the things, just resources. Like, they don't have that many people, and in addition, they don't have, not only do they not have a lot of people, they don't have a lot of technical people. So, and just this, so take this is not a criticism of the ICO what I'm going to explain, because there's very understandable reasons why this happened. But I have had to explain and re-explain and re-explain and re-explain, how relational databases work, right? What is, the product? What is things that in machine learning, what is an eigenvector? What is a PCA? And what is dimensionality reduction? What is things that are technical, so for a layperson, totally understandable that they don't know about any of it, but the fact that a lot of the investigators don't have you know, a robust technical background, I think is something that if I were to make a recommendation, having more technical people, you know, being part of and hand in hand with the enforcement of the law, I think would be really helpful. And that's likely a resource issue. They have put in a ton of time, a ton of resources into this investigation. So, you know, to their credit, they've been trying really, really hard with the really tight resources and limited resources and limited powers that they have. But just as a point of observation, one of the weak points that I've seen in the ICO, again, this is not me, this is an empathetic criticism, if I can call it that, is the lack of technical people. The fact that they have had to ask me a lot of questions that anybody, that a database engineer would not ask. And that was even, you know, right before going in to search an office, you know, asking questions, fairly basic questions about databases, even just asking, you know, what are the file names called? It's like, well, it's more complicated than that. It's not like a sheet with the data on it. It's not in the Facebook data file, right? So that, again, they've been trying really hard, and I think that they've been, you know, doing a decent job at investigating. But the thing that I've noticed is that they are in charge of regulating data, which means that they should have a lot of people who understand how databases work.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that concludes the questions for the members of the committee. We've covered a huge amount of ground in nearly best part of 4 hours of evidence, which is going to be a record for a single panel evidence session. Are there any sort of, you know, closing remarks you have for the committee, or do you feel that you've said all you needed to say?
I have one. I think in the whole discussion so far around the effectiveness of Cambridge Analytica's techniques and everything, it was really focused on the individual level. So when you look at psychographics, the Kogan technique, and so on, it's really at the individual level. Can you convince someone to change candidate based on their psychological profile? But then when you hear all the techniques that Nix talks about, all those things, it's much more about spreading a rumor. It's much more about a collective effect, which is probably easier to generate. You know, the impulse to share information amongst each other on a network. And no one is in a position to investigate this except Facebook. No one is in a position to investigate how Cambridge Analytica might have sought to influence Facebook itself, or the spread of information on Facebook itself, rather than to influence individuals. So I would encourage Facebook itself to look at this question. They seem to have had a blind spot on that, but also, of course, the committee and all the investigators to look at that.
Thank you. Yeah.
He said it perfectly. I don't have anything to add, actually.
Thank you very much. In that case, I'll bring the session to a close. The committee just require the room for a short period of time for a short private meeting with Mr. Wiley, but thank you very much for attending.
Portcullis House, the Thatcher Room. Portcullis House, the Thatcher
DCMS Committee, the 27th of March 2018, the Thatcher Room.
Hey Charlotte County, this is Charlotte County COPWATCH, and I just wanted you to know that I am using this stuff under fair use, and also remember to like and subscribe this channel. Also too, keep in mind I do not make any money on YouTube. This is 5 hours work a day fighting for freedom. And you can donate with PayPal and Patreon. I just want you to think about this. If everybody gives to PayPal and Patreon, Patreon is every month. Actually, PayPal you can do every month. I have 12,000 subscribers. If everybody gives, I can quit my regular job and go full-time investigations on Charlotte County and possibly even more and beyond. So just keep that in mind. If everybody helps out, I can go full-time doing this. Thanks.